control. The sovereign will, of the adept, is represented in our symbols by the woman who crushes the serpent's head, and by the resplendent angel who represses the dragon, and holds him under his foot and spear. The great magical agent, the dual current of light, the living and astral fire of the earth, has been represented in the ancient theogonies by the serpent with the head of a bull, a ram, or a dog. It is the double serpent of the caduceus, it is the old serpent of Genesis, but it is also the brazen serpent of Moses entwined around the Tau, that is to say, the generative lingam. It is also the goat of the witch Sabbath, and the Baphomet of the Templars, it is the Hyle of the Gnostics, it is the double-tailed serpent which forms the legs of the solar cock of Diabraxas, finally, it is the devil of M. Yudes de Mirville. But in very fact it is the blind force which souls, i.e., the lower manas or nephesh, have to conquer to liberate themselves from the bonds of the earth. For if their will does not free them from this fatal attraction, they will be absorbed in the current by the force which has produced them, and will return to the central and eternal fire. 26. The central and eternal fire is that disintegrating force, that gradually consumes and burns out the Kamarupa, or personality, in the Kamaloka, whither it goes after death. And verily, the mediums are attracted by the astral light, it is the direct cause of their personal souls being absorbed by the force which has produced their terrestrial elements. And, therefore, as the same occultist tells us, all the magical operations consist in freeing oneself from the coils of the ancient serpent, then to place the foot on its head, and lead it according to the operator's will. I will give unto thee, says the serpent, in the gospel myth, all the kingdoms of the earth, if thou wilt fall down and worship me. The initiated should reply to him, I will not fall down, but thou shalt crouch at my feet. Thou wilt give me nothing, but I will make use of thee and take whatever I wish. For I am thy Lord and Master. And as such, the personal ego, becoming at one with its divine parent, shares in the immortality of the latter. Otherwise. Enough, however. Blessed is he who has acquainted himself with the dual powers at work in the astral light. Thrice blessed he who has learned to discern the noetic from the psychic action of the double-faced God in him, and who knows the potency of his own spirit, or soul dynamics. Cosmic mind. Whatsoever quits the Leia, homogeneous, state, becomes active conscious life. Individual consciousness emanates from, and returns into absolute consciousness, which is eternal motion. Esoteric axioms. Whatever that be which thinks, which understands, which wills, which acts, it is something celestial and divine, and upon that account must necessarily be eternal. Cicero. Edison's conception of matter was quoted in our March editorial article. The great American electrician is reported by Mr. G. Parsons Lathrop in Harper's Magazine as giving out his personal belief about the atoms being possessed by a certain amount of intelligence, and shown indulging in other reveries of this kind. For this flight of fancy the February Review of Reviews takes the inventor of the phonograph to task and critically remarks that Edison is much given to dreaming, his scientific imagination being constantly at work. Would to goodness the men of science exercised their scientific imagination a little more and their dogmatic and cold negations a little less. Dreams differ. In that strange state of being which, as Byron has it, puts us in a position, with sealed eyes to see, one often perceives more real facts than when awake. Imagination is, again, one of the strongest elements in human nature, or in the words of Douglas Stewart it is the great spring of human activity, and the principal source of human improvement. Destroy the faculty, and the condition of men will become as stationary as that of brutes. It is the best guide of our blind senses, without which the latter could never lead us beyond matter and its illusions. The greatest discoveries of modern science are due to the imaginative faculty of the discoverers. But when has anything new been postulated, when a theory clashing with and contradicting a comfortably settled predecessor put forth, without orthodox science first sitting on it, and trying to crush it out of existence? Harvey was also regarded at first as a dreamer, and a madman to boot. Finally, the whole of modern science is formed of working hypotheses, the fruits of scientific imagination, as Mr. Tyndall felicitously called it. Is it then, because consciousness in every universal atom and the possibility of a complete control over the cells and atoms of his body by man, have not been honored so far with the imprimatur of the popes of exact science, that the idea is to be dismissed as a dream? Occultism gives the same teaching. Occultism tells us that every atom, like the monad of Leibniz, is a little universe in itself. And that every organ and cell in the human body is endowed with a brain of its own, with memory, therefore, experience and discriminative powers. The idea of universal life composed of individual atomic lives is one of the oldest teachings of esoteric philosophy, and the very modern hypothesis of modern science, that of crystalline life, is the first ray from the ancient luminary of knowledge that has reached our scholars. If plants can be shown to have nerves and sensations and instinct, but another word for consciousness, why not allow the same in the cells of the human body? Science divides matter into organic and inorganic bodies, only because it rejects the idea of absolute life and a life principle as an entity, otherwise it would be the first to see that absolute life cannot produce even a geometrical point, or an atom inorganic in its essence. But occultism, you see, teaches mysteries, they say, and mystery is the negation of common sense, just as again metaphysics is but a kind of poetry, according to Mr. Tyndall. There is no such thing for science as mystery. And therefore, as a life principle is, and must remain for the intellects of our civilized races forever a mystery on physical lines, they who deal in this question have to be of necessity either fools or knaves. Dixit. Nevertheless, we may repeat with a French preacher, mystery is the fatality of science. Official science is surrounded on every side and hedged in by unapproachable, forever impenetrable mysteries. And why? Simply because physical science is self-doomed to a squirrel-like progress around a wheel of matter limited by our five senses. And though it is as confessedly ignorant of the formation of matter, as of the generation of a simple cell, though it is as powerless to explain what is this, that, or the other, it will yet dogmatize and insist on what life, matter, and the rest are not. It comes to this: the words of Father Felix addressed 50 years ago to the French academicians have nearly become immortal as a truism. Gentlemen, he said, you throw into our teeth the reproach that we teach mysteries. But imagine whatever science you will, follow the magnificent sweep of its deductions. And when you arrive at its parent source you come face to face with the unknown. Now to lay at rest once for all in the minds of theosophists this vexed question, we intend to prove that modern science, owing to physiology, is itself on the eve of discovering that consciousness is universal, thus justifying Edison's dreams. But before we do this, we mean also to show that though many a man of science is soaked through and through with such belief, very few are brave enough to openly admit it, as the late Dr. Pyrogoff of St. Petersburg has done in his posthumous memoirs. Indeed, that great surgeon and pathologist raised by their publication quite a howl of indignation among his colleagues. How then? The public asked, he, Dr. Pyrogoff, whom we regarded as almost the embodiment of European learning, believing in the superstitions of crazy alchemists. He, who in the words of a contemporary, was the very incarnation of exact science and methods of thought, who had dissected hundreds and thousands of human organs, making himself as acquainted with all the mysteries of surgery and anatomy as we are with our familiar furniture. The savant for whom physiology had no secrets and who, above all men, was one to whom Voltaire might have ironically asked whether he had not found a mortal soul between the bladder and the blind gut. That same Pyrogoff is found after his death devoting whole chapters in his literary will to the scientific demonstration. Novoe Vremya of 1887. Of what? Why, of the existence in every organism of a distinct, vital force independent of any physical or chemical process. Like Liebig, he accepted the derided and tabooed homogeneity of nature, a life principle, that persecuted and hapless teleology, or the science of the final causes of things, which is as philosophical as it is unscientific. If we have to believe imperial and royal academies. His unpardonable sin in the eyes of dogmatic modern science, however, was this: the great anatomist and surgeon, had the hardihood to declare in his memoirs that we have no cause to reject the possibility of the existence of organisms endowed with such properties that would make of them the direct embodiment of the universal mind, a perfection inaccessible to our own, human, mind. Because, we have no right to maintain that man is the last expression of the divine creative thought. Such are the chief features of the heresy of one, who ranked high among the men of exact science of this age. His memoirs show plainly that not only he believed in universal deity, divine ideation, or the Hermetic thought divine, and a vital principle, but taught all this, and tried to demonstrate it scientifically. Thus he argues that universal mind needs no physico-chemical, or mechanical brain as an organ of transmission. He even goes so far as to admit it in these suggestive words. Our reason must accept in all necessity an infinite and eternal mind which rules and governs the ocean of life. Thought and creative ideation, in full agreement with the laws of unity and causation, manifest themselves plainly enough in universal life without the participation of brain slush. Directing the forces and elements toward the formation of organisms, this organizing life principle becomes self-sentient, self-conscious, racial or individual. Substance, ruled and directed by the life principle, is organized according to a general defined plan into certain types. He explains this belief by confessing that never, during his long life so full of study, observation, and experiments, could he acquire the conviction that our brain could be the only organ of thought in the whole universe. That everything in this world, save that organ, should be unconditioned and senseless, and that human thought alone should impart to the universe a meaning and a reasonable harmony in its integrity. And he adds apropos of Molescott's materialism. Howsoever much fish and peas I may eat, never shall I consent to give away my ego into durance vile of a product casually extracted by modern alchemy from the urine. If, in our conceptions of the universe it be our fate to fall into illusions, then my illusion has, at least, the advantage of being very consoling. For, it shows to me an intelligent universe and the activity of forces working in it harmoniously and intelligently, and that my I is not the product of chemical and histological elements but an embodiment of a common universal mind. The latter, I sense and represent to myself as acting in free will and consciousness in accordance with the same laws which are traced for the guidance of my own mind, but only exempt from that restraint which trammels our human conscious individuality. For, as remarks elsewhere this great and philosophic man of science, the limitless and the eternal, is not only a postulate of our mind and reason, but also a gigantic fact, in itself. What would become of our ethical or moral principle were not the everlasting and integral truth to serve it as a foundation? The above selections translated verbatim from the confessions of one who was during his long life a star of the first magnitude in the fields of pathology and surgery, show him imbued and soaked through with the philosophy of a reasoned and scientific mysticism. In reading the memoirs of that man of scientific fame, we feel proud of finding him accepting, almost wholesale, the fundamental doctrines and beliefs of theosophy. With such an exceptionally scientific mind in the ranks of mystics, the idiotic grins, the cheap satires and flings at our great philosophy by some European and American freethinkers, become almost a compliment. More than ever do they appear to us like the frightened discordant cry of the night owl hurrying to hide in its dark ruins before the light of the morning sun. The progress of physiology itself, as we have just said, is a sure warrant that the dawn of that day when a full recognition of a universally diffused mind will be an accomplished fact, is not far off. It is only a question of time. For, notwithstanding the boast of physiology, that the aim of its researches is only the summing up of every vital function in order to bring them into a definite order by showing their mutual relations to, and connection with, the laws of physics and chemistry, hence, in their final form with mechanical laws, we fear there is a good deal of contradiction between the confessed object and the speculations of some of the best of our modern physiologists, while few of them would dare to return as openly as did Dr. Pyrogoff to the exploded superstition of vitalism and the severely exiled life principle, the principium vitae of Paracelsus, yet physiology stands sorely perplexed in the face of its ablest representatives before certain facts. Unfortunately for us, this age of ours is not conducive to the development of moral courage. The time for most to act on the noble idea of principia non homines has not yet come. And yet there are exceptions to the general rule, and physiology, whose destiny it is to become the handmaiden of occult truths, has not let the latter remain without their witnesses. There are those who are already stoutly protesting against certain hitherto favored propositions. For instance, some physiologists are already denying that it is the forces and substances of so-called inanimate nature, which are acting exclusively in living beings. For, as they well argue, the fact that we reject the interference of other forces in living things depends entirely on the limitations of our senses. We use, indeed, the same organs for our observations of both animate and inanimate nature. And these organs can receive manifestations of only a limited realm of motion. Vibrations passed along the fibers of our optic nerves to the brain reach our perceptions through our consciousness as sensations of light and color. Vibrations affecting our consciousness through our auditory organs strike us as sounds. All our feelings, through whichever of our senses, are due to nothing but motions. Such are the teachings of physical science, and such were in their roughest outlines those of occultism, eons and millenniums back. The difference, however, and most vital distinction between the two teachings, is this: official science sees in motion simply a blind, unreasoning force or law. Occultism, tracing motion to its origin, identifies it with the universal deity, and calls this eternal ceaseless motion, the great breath. 27. Nevertheless, however limited the conception of modern science about the said force, still it is suggestive enough to have forced the following remark from a great scientist, the present professor of physiology at the University of Bâle. 28, who speaks like an occultist. It would be folly in us to expect to be ever able to discover, with the assistance only of our external senses, in animate nature that something which we are unable to find in the inanimate. And forthwith the lecturer adds that man being endowed, in addition to his physical senses, with an inner sense, a perception which gives him the possibility of observing the states and phenomena of his own consciousness. He has to use that in dealing with animate nature, a profession of faith verging suspiciously on the borders of occultism. He denies, moreover, the assumption, that the states and phenomena of consciousness represent in substance the same manifestations of motion as in the external world. And bases his denial by the reminder that not all of such states and manifestations have necessarily a spatial extension. According to him, that only is connected with our conception of space which has reached our consciousness through sight, touch, and the muscular sense, while all the other senses, all the effects, tendencies, as all the interminable series of representations, have no extension in space but only in time. Thus he asks, where then is there room in this for a mechanical theory? Objectors might argue that this is so only in appearance, while in reality all these have a spatial extension. But such an argument would be entirely erroneous. Our sole reason for believing that objects perceived by the senses have such extension in the external world, rests on the idea that they seem to do so, as far as they can be watched and observed through the senses of sight and touch. With regard, however, to the realm of our inner senses, even that supposed foundation loses its force and there is no ground for admitting it. The winding-up argument of the lecturer is most interesting to theosophists. Says this physiologist of the modern school of materialism. Thus, a deeper and more direct acquaintance with our inner nature unveils to us a world entirely unlike the world represented to us by our external senses. And reveals the most heterogeneous faculties, shows objects having naught to do with spatial extension, and phenomena absolutely disconnected with those that fall under mechanical laws. Hitherto the opponents of vitalism and life principle, as well as the followers of the mechanical theory of life, based their views on the supposed fact, that, as physiology was progressing forward, its students succeeded more and more in connecting its functions with the laws of blind matter. All those manifestations that used to be attributed to a mystical life force, they said, may be brought now under physical and chemical laws. And they were, and still are loudly clamoring for the recognition of the fact that it is only a question of time when it will be triumphantly demonstrated that the whole vital process, in its grand totality, represents nothing more mysterious than a very complicated phenomenon of motion, exclusively governed by the forces of inanimate nature. But here we have a professor of physiology who asserts that the history of physiology proves, unfortunately for them, quite the contrary. And he pronounces these ominous words. I maintain that the more our experiments and observations are exact and many-sided, the deeper we penetrate into facts, the more we try to fathom and speculate on the phenomena of life. The more we acquire the conviction, that even those phenomena that we had hoped to be already able to explain by physical and chemical laws, are in reality unfathomable. They are vastly more complicated, in fact, and as we stand at present, they will not yield to any mechanical explanation. This is a terrible blow at the puffed-up bladder known as materialism, which is as empty as it is dilated. A Judas in the camp of the apostles of negation, the animalists. But the bald professor is no solitary exception, as we have just shown, and there are several physiologists who are of his way of thinking. Indeed, some of them going so far as to almost accept free will and consciousness, in the simplest monadic protoplasms. One discovery after the other tends in this direction. The works of some German physiologists are especially interesting with regard to cases of consciousness and positive discrimination, one is almost inclined to say thought, in the amoebas. Now the amoebas or animalculae are, as all know, microscopical protoplasms, as the Vampirella cyrogyra for instance, a most simple elementary cell, a protoplasmic drop, formless and almost structureless. And yet it shows in its behavior something for which zoologists, if they do not call it mind and power of reasoning, will have to find some other qualification, and coin a new term. For see what Sienkowski 29 says of it. Speaking of this microscopical, bare, reddish cell, he describes the way in which it hunts for and finds among a number of other aquatic plants one called Spirogyra, rejecting every other food. Examining its peregrinations under a powerful microscope, he found it when moved by hunger, first projecting its pseudopodii, false feet, by the help of which it crawls. Then it commences moving about until among a great variety of plants it comes across a Spirogyra, after which it proceeds toward the cellulated portion of one of the cells of the latter, and placing itself on it, it bursts the tissue, sucks the contents of one cell and then passes on to another, repeating the same process. This naturalist never saw it take any other food, and it never touched any of the numerous plants placed by Sienkowski in its way. Mentioning another amoeba, the Culpidella pugnax, he says that he found it showing the same predilection for the chlamydomonas on which it feeds exclusively. Having made a puncture in the body of the chlamydomonas, it sucks its chlorophyll and then goes away, he writes, adding these significant words, the way of acting of these monads during their search for and reception of food is so amazing that one is almost inclined to see in them consciously acting beings. Not less suggestive are the observations of Th.W. Engelmann, Beiträge zur Physiologie de Protoplasm, on the Arcella, another unicellular organism only a trifle more complex than the Vampirella. He shows them in a drop of water under a microscope on a piece of glass, lying so to speak, on their backs, i.e. on their convex side, so that the pseudopodii, projected from the edge of the shell, find no hold in space and leave the amoeba helpless. Under these circumstances the following curious fact is observed. Under the very edge of one of the sides of the protoplasm gas bubbles begin immediately to form, which, making that side lighter, allow it to be raised, bringing at the same time the opposite side of the creature into contact with the glass. Thus furnishing its pseudo or false feet means to get hold of the surface and thereby turning over its body to raise itself on all its pseudopodii. After this, the amoeba proceeds to suck back into itself the gas bubbles and begins to move. If a like drop of water is placed on the lower extremity of the glass, then, following the law of gravity, the amoeba will find themselves at first at the lower end of the drop of water. Failing to find there a point of support, they proceed to generate large bubbles of gas, when, becoming lighter than the water, they are raised up to the surface of the drop. In the words of Engelmann, If having reached the surface of the glass they find no more support for their feet than before, forthwith one sees the gas globules diminishing on one side and increasing in size and number on the other, or both. Until the creatures touch with the edge of their shell the surface of the glass, and are enabled to turn over. No sooner is this done than the gas globules disappear and the arceli begin crawling. Detach them carefully by means of a fine needle from the surface of the glass and thus bring them down once more to the lower surface of the drop of water. And forthwith they will repeat the same process, varying its details according to necessity in devising new means to reach their desired aim. Try as much as you will to place them in uncomfortable positions, and they find means to extricate themselves from them each time, by one device or the other, and no sooner have they succeeded than the gas bubbles disappear. It is impossible not to admit that such facts as these point to the presence of some psychic process in the protoplasm. 30. Among hundreds of accusations against Asiatic nations of degrading superstitions, based on crass ignorance, there exists no more serious denunciation than that which accuses and convicts them of personifying and even deifying the chief organs of, and in, the human body. Indeed, do not we hear these benighted fools of Hindus speaking of the smallpox as a goddess, thus personifying the microbes of the variolic virus? Do we not read about tantrikas, a sect of mystics, giving proper names to nerves, cells and arteries, connecting and identifying various parts of the body with deities, endowing functions and physiological processes with intelligence, and what not? The vertebrae, fibers, ganglia, the cord, etc., of the spinal column, the heart, its four chambers, auricle and ventricle, valves and the rest. Stomach, liver, lungs and spleen, everything has its special deific name, is believed to act consciously and to act under the potent will of the yogi, whose head and heart are the seats of Brahma and the various parts of whose body are all the pleasure grounds of this or another deity. This is indeed ignorance. Especially when we think that the said organs, and the whole body of man are composed of cells. And these cells are now being recognized as individual organisms and, quien sabe, will come perhaps to be recognized someday as an independent race of thinkers inhabiting the globe, called man. It really looks like it. For was it not hitherto believed that all the phenomena of assimilation and sucking in of food by the intestinal canal, could be explained by the laws of diffusion and endosmosis? And now, alas, physiologists have come to learn that the action of the intestinal canal during the act of absorbing, is not identical with the action of the non-living membrane in the dialyzer. It is now well demonstrated that, this wall is covered with epithelium cells, each of which is an organism per se, a living being, and with very complex functions. We know further, that such a cell assimilates food, by means of active contractions of its protoplasmic body, in a manner as mysterious as that which we notice in the independent amoeba and animalcules. We can observe on the intestinal epithelium of the cold-blooded animals how these cells project shoots, pseudopodii, out of their contractive, bare, protoplasmic bodies, which pseudopodii, or false feet, fish out of the food drops of fat, suck them into their protoplasm and send it further, toward the lymph duct. The lymphatic cells issuing from the nests of the adipose tissue, and squeezing themselves through the epithelium cells up to the surface of the intestines, absorb therein the drops of fat and loaded with their prey, travel homeward to the lymphatic canals. So long as this active work of the cells remained unknown to us, the fact that while the globules of fat penetrated through the walls of the intestines into lymphatic channels, the smallest of pigmental grains introduced into the intestines did not do so, remained unexplained. But today we know, that this faculty of selecting their special food, of assimilating the useful and rejecting the useless and the harmful, is common to all the unicellular organisms. 31. And the lecturer queries, why, if this discrimination in the selection of food exists in the simplest and most elementary of the cells, in the formless and structureless protoplasmic drops, why it should not exist also in the epithelium cells of our intestinal canal. Indeed, if the vampirella recognizes its much beloved Spirogyra, among hundreds of other plants as shown above, why should not the epithelium cell, sense, choose and select its favorite drop of fat from a pigmental grain. But we will be told that sensing, choosing, and selecting pertain only to reasoning beings, at least to the instinct of more structural animals than is the protoplasmic cell outside or inside man. Agreed. But as we translate from the lecture of a learned physiologist and the works of other learned naturalists, we can only say, that these learned gentlemen must know what they are talking about. Though they are probably ignorant of the fact that their scientific prose is but 1 degree removed from the ignorant, superstitious, but rather poetical, twaddle, of the Hindu yogis and tantrikas. Anyhow, our professor of physiology falls foul of the materialistic theories of diffusion and endosmosis. Armed with the facts of the evident discrimination and a mind in the cells, he demonstrates by numerous instances the fallacy of trying to explain certain physiological processes by mechanical theories. Such for instance as the passing of sugar from the liver, where it is transformed into glucose, into the blood. Physiologists find great difficulty in explaining this process, and regard it as an impossibility to bring it under the endosmosic laws. In all probability the lymphatic cells play just as active a part during the absorption of alimentary substances dissolved in water, as the peptics do, a process well demonstrated by F. Hofmeister. 32 Generally speaking, poor convenient endosmos is dethroned and exiled from among the active functionaries of the human body as a useless sinecurist. It has lost its voice in the matter of glands and other agents of secretion, in the action of which the same epithelium cells have replaced it. The mysterious faculties of selection, of extracting from the blood one kind of substance and rejecting another, of transforming the former by means of decomposition and synthesis, of directing some of the products into passages which will throw them out of the body and redirecting others into lymphatic and blood vessels, such is the work of the cells. It is evident that in all this there is not the slightest hint at diffusion or endosmos, says the bald physiologist. It becomes entirely useless to try and explain these phenomena by chemical laws. But perhaps physiology is luckier in some other department. Failing in the laws of alimentation, it may have found some consolation for its mechanical theories in the question of the activity of muscles and nerves, which it sought to explain by electric laws. Alas, save in a few fishes, in no other living organisms, least of all in the human body, could it find any possibility of pointing out electric currents as the chief ruling agency. Electrobiology on the lines of pure dynamic electricity has egregiously failed. Ignorant of Fohat, no electrical currents suffice to explain to it either muscular or nervous activity. But there is such a thing as the physiology of external sensations. Here we are no longer on terra incognita, and all such phenomena have already found purely physical explanations. No doubt, there is the phenomenon of sight, the eye with its optical apparatus, its camera obscura. But the fact of the sameness of the reproduction of things in the eye, according to the same laws of refraction as on the plate of a photographic machine, is no vital phenomenon. The same may be reproduced on a dead eye. The phenomenon of life consists in the evolution and development of the eye itself. How is this marvelous and complicated work produced? To this physiology replies, we do not know. For, toward the solution of this great problem, physiology has not yet made one single step. True, we can follow the sequence of the stages of the development and formation of the eye, but why it is so and what is the causal connection, we have absolutely no idea. The second vital phenomenon of the eye is its accommodating activity. And here we are again face to face with the functions of nerves and muscles, our old insoluble riddles. The same may be said of all the organs of sense. The same also relates to other departments of physiology. We had hoped to explain the phenomena of the circulation of the blood by the laws of hydrostatics or hydrodynamics. Of course the blood moves in accordance with the hydrodynamical laws, but its relation to them remains utterly passive. As to the active functions of the heart and the muscles of its vessels, no one, so far, has ever been able to explain them by physical laws. The underlined words in the concluding portion of the able professor's lecture are worthy of an occultist. Indeed, he seems to be repeating an aphorism from the elementary instructions of the esoteric physiology of practical occultism. The riddle of life is found in the active functions of a living organism. 33. The real perception of which activity we can get only through self-observation, and not owing to our external senses. By observations on our will, so far as it penetrates our consciousness, thus revealing itself to our inner sense. Therefore, when the same phenomenon acts only on our external senses, we recognize it no longer. We see everything that takes place around and near the phenomenon of motion, but the essence of that phenomenon we do not see at all, because we lack for it a special organ of receptivity. We can accept that SE in a mere hypothetical way, and do so, in fact, when we speak of active functions. Thus does every physiologist, for he cannot go on without such hypothesis. And this is a first experiment of a psychological explanation of all vital phenomena. And if it is demonstrated to us that we are unable with the help only of physics and chemistry to explain the phenomena of life, what may we expect from other adjuncts of physiology, from the sciences of morphology, anatomy, and histology? I maintain that these can never help us to unriddle the problem of any of the mysterious phenomena of life. For, after we have succeeded with the help of scalpel and microscope in dividing the organisms into their most elementary compounds, and reached the simplest of cells, it is just here that we find ourselves face to face with the greatest problem of all. The simplest monad, a microscopical point of protoplasm, formless and structureless, exhibits yet all the essential vital functions, alimentation, growth, breeding, motion, feeling and sensuous perception. And even such functions which replace consciousness, the soul of the higher animals. The problem, for materialism, is a terrible one, indeed. Shall our cells, and infinitesimal monads in nature, do for us that which the arguments of the greatest pantheistic philosophers have hitherto failed to do? Let us hope so. And if they do, then the superstitious and ignorant Eastern yogis, and even their exoteric followers, will find themselves vindicated. For we hear from the same physiologist that a large number of poisons are prevented by the epithelium cells from penetrating into lymphatic spaces, though we know that they are easily decomposed in the abdominal and intestinal juices. More than this, physiology is aware that by injecting these poisons directly into the blood, they will separate from, and reappear through the intestinal walls, and that in this process the lymphatic cells take a most active part. If the reader turns to Webster's dictionary he will find therein a curious explanation at the words lymphatic and lymph. Etymologists think that the Latin word lympha is derived from the Greek nymphe, a nymph or inferior goddess, they say. The Muses were sometimes called nymphs by the poets. Hence, according to Webster, all persons in a state of rapture, as seers, poets, madmen, etc., were said to be caught by the nymphs. The goddess of moisture, the Greek and Latin nymph or lymph, then, is fabled in India as being born from the pores of one of the gods, whether the ocean god, Varuna, or a minor river god is left to the particular sect and fancy of the believers. But the main question is, that the ancient Greeks and Latins are thus admittedly known to have shared in the same superstitions as the Hindus. This superstition is shown in their maintaining to this day that every atom of matter in the 4, or 5, elements is an emanation from an inferior god or goddess, himself or herself an earlier emanation from a superior deity. And, moreover, that each of these atoms, being Brahma, one of whose names is Anu, or Atom, no sooner is it emanated than it becomes endowed with consciousness, each of its kind, and free will, acting within the limits of law. Now, he who knows that the cosmic Trimurti, Trinity, composed of Brahma, the Creator, Vishnu, the Preserver, and Shiva, the Destroyer, is a most magnificent and scientific symbol of the material universe and its gradual evolution. And who finds a proof of this, in the etymology of the names of these deities 34, plus the doctrines of Gupta Vidya, or esoteric knowledge, knows also how to correctly understand this superstition. The 5 fundamental titles of Vishnu, added to that of Anu, Atom, common to all the trimurtic personages, which are, Buddhatman, one with the created or emanated materials of the world, Pradhanatman, one with the senses. Paramatman, Supreme Soul, and Atman, Cosmic Soul, or the Universal Mind, show sufficiently what the ancient Hindus meant by endowing with mind and consciousness every atom and giving it a distinct name of a god or a goddess. Place their pantheon, composed of 30 crores, or 300 millions, of deities within the macrocosm, the universe, or inside the microcosm, man, and the number will not be found overrated, since they relate to the atoms, cells, and molecules of everything that is. This, no doubt, is too poetical and abstruse for our generation, but it seems decidedly as scientific, if not more so, than the teachings derived from the latest discoveries of physiology and natural history. The dual aspect of wisdom. No doubt but ye are the people and wisdom shall die with you. Job 12, 2. But wisdom is justified of her children. Matthew 11, 19. It is the privilege, as also occasionally the curse, of editors to receive numerous letters of advice, and the conductors of Lucifer have not escaped the common lot. Reared in the aphorisms of the ages, they are aware that he who can take advice is superior to him who gives it, and are therefore ready to accept with gratitude any sound and practical suggestions offered by friends. But the last letter received does not fulfill the condition. It is not even his own wisdom, but that of the age we live in, which is asserted by our advisor, who thus seriously risks his reputation for keen observation by such acts of devotion on the altar of modern pretensions. It is in defense of the wisdom of our century that we are taken to task, and charged with preferring barbarous antiquity to our modern civilization and its inestimable boons. With forgetting that our own day wisdom compared with the awakening instincts of the past is in no way inferior in philosophic wisdom even to the age of Plato. We are lastly told that we, theosophists, are too fond of the dim yesterday, and as unjust to our glorious present day, the bright noon hour of the highest civilization and culture. Well, all this is a question of taste. Our correspondent is welcome to his own views, but so are we to ours. Let him imagine that the Eiffel Tower dwarfs the Pyramid of Gizeh into a molehill, and the Crystal Palace grounds transform the hanging gardens of Semiramis into a kitchen garden, if he likes. But if we are seriously challenged by him to show, in what respect our age of hourly progress and gigantic thought, a progress a trifle marred, however, by our Huxleys being denounced by our surgeons, and the university ladies, senior classics and wranglers, by the Hallelujah lasses, is inferior to the ages of, say, a henpecked Socrates and a cross-legged Buddha, then we will answer him, giving him, of course, our own personal opinion. Our age, we say, is inferior in wisdom to any other, because it professes, more visibly every day, contempt for truth and justice, without which there can be no wisdom. Because our civilization, built up of shams and appearances, is at best like a beautiful green morass, a bog, spread over a deadly quagmire. Because this century of culture and worship of matter, while offering prizes and premiums for every best thing under the sun, from the biggest baby and the largest orchid down to the strongest pugilist and the fattest pig, has no encouragement to offer to morality, no prize to give for any moral virtue. Because it has societies for the prevention of physical cruelty to animals, and none with the object of preventing the moral cruelty practiced on human beings. Because it encourages, legally and tacitly, vice under every form, from the sale of whiskey down to forced prostitution and theft brought on by starvation wages, Shylock-like exaction, rents and other comforts of our cultured period. Because, finally, this is the age which, although proclaimed as one of physical and moral freedom, is in truth the age of the most ferocious moral and mental slavery, the like of which was never known before. Slavery to state and men has disappeared only to make room for slavery to things and self, to one's own vices and idiotic social customs and ways. Rapid civilization, adapted to the needs of the higher and middle classes, has doomed by contrast to only greater wretchedness the starving masses. Having leveled the two former, it has made them the more to disregard the substance in favor of form and appearance, thus forcing modern man into duress vile, a slavish dependence on things inanimate. To use and to serve which is the first bounded duty of every cultured man. Where then is the wisdom of our modern age? In truth, it requires but a very few lines to show why we bow before ancient wisdom, while refusing absolutely to see any in our modern civilization. But to begin with, what does our critic mean by the word wisdom? Though we have never too unreasonably admired Lactantius, yet we must recognize that even that innocent church father, with all his cutting insults anent the heliocentric system, defined the term very correctly when saying that, the first point of wisdom is to discern that which is false, and the second, to know that which is true. And if so, what chance is there for our century of falsification, from the revised Bible texts down to natural butter, to put forth a claim to wisdom? But before we cross lances on this subject, we may do well, perchance, to define the term ourselves. Let us premise by saying that wisdom is, at best, an elastic word, at any rate as used in European tongues. That it yields no clear idea of its meaning, unless preceded or followed by some qualifying adjective. In the Bible, indeed, the Hebrew equivalent chokmah, in Greek, sophia, is applied to the most dissimilar things, abstract and concrete. Thus we find wisdom as the characteristic both of divine inspiration and also of terrestrial cunning and craft, as meaning the secret knowledge of the esoteric sciences, and also blind faith, the fear of the Lord, and Pharaoh's magicians. The noun is indifferently applied to Christ and to sorcery, for the which Sedekla is also referred to as the wise woman of Endor. From the earliest Christian antiquity, beginning with St. James 3:13-17, down to the last Calvinist preacher, who sees in hell and eternal damnation a proof of the Almighty's wisdom, the term has been used with the most varied meanings. But St. James teaches two kinds of wisdom, a teaching with which we fully concur. He draws a strong line of separation between the divine or noetic, Sophia, the wisdom from above, and the terrestrial, psychic, and devilish wisdom, 3:15. For the true theosophist there is no wisdom save the former. Would that such an one could declare with Paul, that he speaks that wisdom exclusively only among them that are perfect, i.e., those initiated into its mysteries, or familiar, at least, with the ABC of the sacred sciences. But, however great was his mistake, however premature his attempt to sow the seeds of the true and eternal gnosis on unprepared soil, his motives were yet good and his intention unselfish, and therefore has he been stoned. For had he only attempted to preach some particular fiction of his own, or done it for gain, who would have ever singled him out or tried to crush him, amid the hundreds of other false sects, daily collections, and crazy societies? But his case was different. However cautiously, still he spoke, not the wisdom of this world, but truth or the hidden wisdom, which none of the princes of this world know, I Corinth. 2, least of all the archons of our modern science. With regard to psychic wisdom, however, which James defines as terrestrial and devilish, it has existed in all ages, from the days of Pythagoras and Plato, when for one philosophist there were 9 sophisti, down to our modern era. To such wisdom our century is welcome, and indeed fully entitled, to lay a claim. Moreover, it is an attire easy to put on. There never was a period when crows refused to array themselves in peacock's feathers, if the opportunity was offered. But now as then, we have a right to analyze the terms used and inquire in the words of the Book of Job, that suggestive allegory of karmic purification and initiation rites, where shall true wisdom be found? Where is the place of understanding? And to answer again in his words, with the ancient is wisdom and in the length of days understanding. Job 28:12 and 12:12. Here we have to qualify once more a dubious term, viz., the word ancient, and to explain it. As interpreted by the Orthodox churches, it has in the mouth of Job one meaning, but with the Kabbalist, quite another. While in the gnosis of the occultist and theosophist it has distinctly a third signification, the same which it had in the original Book of Job, a pre-Mosaic work and a recognized treatise on initiation. Thus, the Kabbalist applies the adjective ancient to the manifested word or logos, daber, of the forever concealed and uncognizable deity. Daniel, in one of his visions, also uses it when speaking of Yahweh, the androgynous Adam Kadmon. The church man connects it with his anthropomorphic Jehovah, the Lord God, of the translated Bible. But the Eastern occultist employs the mystic term only when referring to the reincarnating higher ego. For, divine wisdom being diffused throughout the infinite universe, and our impersonal higher self being an integral part of it, the atmic light of the latter can be centered only in that which though eternal is still individualized, i.e. the noetic principle, the manifested God within each rational being, or our higher manas at one with Buddhi. It is this collective light which is the wisdom that is from above, and which whenever it descends on the personal ego, is found pure, peaceable, gentle. Hence, Job's assertion that wisdom is with the ancient, or Buddhi-manas. For the divine spiritual I is alone eternal, and the same throughout all births, whereas the personalities it informs in succession are evanescent, changing like the shadows of a kaleidoscopic series of forms in a magic lantern. It is the ancient, because, whether it be called Sophia, Krishna, Buddhi-manas or Christos, it is ever the firstborn of Alayamahat, the universal soul and the intelligence of the universe. Esoterically then, Job's statement must read, with the ancient, man's higher ego, is wisdom, and in the length of days, or number of its reincarnations, is understanding. No man can learn true and final wisdom in one birth. And every new rebirth, whether we be reincarnated for weal or for woe, is one more lesson we receive at the hands of the stern yet ever just schoolmaster, karmic life. But the world, the Western world, at any rate, knows nothing of this, and refuses to learn anything. For it, any notion of the divine ego or the plurality of its births is heathen foolishness. The Western world rejects these truths, and will recognize no wise men except those of its own making, created in its own image, born within its own Christian era and teachings. The only wisdom it understands and practices is the psychic, the terrestrial and devilish wisdom spoken of by James, thus making of the real wisdom a misnomer and a degradation. Yet, without considering her multiplied varieties, there are two kinds of even terrestrial wisdom on our globe of mud, the real and the apparent. Between the two, there is even for the superficial observer of this busy wicked world, a wide chasm, and yet how very few people will consent to see it. The reason for this is quite natural. So strong is human selfishness, that wherever there is the smallest personal interest at stake, there men become deaf and blind to the truth, as often consciously as not. Nor are many people capable of recognizing as speedily as is advisable the difference between men who are wise and those who only seem wise, the latter being chiefly regarded as such because they are very clever at blowing their own trumpet. So much for wisdom in the profane world. As to the world of the students in mystic lore, it is almost worse. Things have strangely altered since the days of antiquity, when the truly wise made it their first duty to conceal their knowledge, deeming it too sacred to even mention before the hoi polloi. While the medieval Rose Croix, the true philosopher, keeping old Socrates in mind, repeated daily that all he knew was that he knew nothing, his modern self-styled successor announces in our day, through press and public, that those mysteries in nature and her occult laws of which he knows nothing, have never existed at all. There was a time when the acquirement of divine wisdom, sapientia, required the sacrifice and devotion of a man's whole life. It depended on such things as the purity of the candidate's motives, on his fearlessness and independence of spirit. But now, to receive a patent for wisdom and adeptship requires only unblushing impudence. A certificate of divine wisdom is now decreed, and delivered to a self-styled adeptus, by a regular majority of votes of profane and easily caught gulls. While a host of magpies driven away from the roof of the Temple of Science will herald it to the world in every marketplace and fair. Tell the public that now, even as of old, the genuine and sincere observer of life and its underlying phenomena, the intelligent co-worker with nature, may, by becoming an expert in her mysteries thereby become a wise man. In the terrestrial sense of the word, but that never will a materialist wrench from nature any secret on a higher plane, and you will be laughed to scorn. Add, that no wisdom from above descends on any one save on the sine qua non condition of leaving at the threshold of the occult every atom of selfishness or desire for personal ends and benefit, and you will be speedily declared by your audience a candidate for the lunatic asylum. Nevertheless, this is an old, very old truism. Nature gives up her innermost secrets and imparts true wisdom only to him, who seeks truth for its own sake, and who craves for knowledge in order to confer benefits on others, not on his own unimportant personality. And, as it is precisely to this personal benefit that nearly every candidate for adeptship and magic looks, and that few are they who consent to learn at such a heavy price and so small a benefit for themselves in prospect, the really wise occultists become with every century fewer and rarer. How many are there, indeed, who would not prefer the will-o'-the-wisp of even passing fame to the steady and ever-growing light of eternal, divine knowledge, if the latter has to remain, for all but oneself, a light under the bushel? The same is the case in the world of materialistic science, where we see a great paucity of really learned men and a host of skin-deep scientists, who yet demand each and all to be regarded as Archimedes and Newtons. As above so below. Scholars who pursue knowledge for the sake of truth and fact, and give these out, however unpalatable, and not for the dubious glory of enforcing on the world their respective personal hobbies, may be counted on the fingers of one hand, while legion is the name of the pretenders. In our day, reputations for learning seem to be built by suggestion on the hypnotic principle, rather than by real merit. The masses cower before him who imposes himself upon them, hence such a galaxy of men regarded as eminent in science, arts and literature. And if they are so easily accepted, it is precisely because of the gigantic self-opinionated and self-assertion of, at any rate, the majority of them. Once thoroughly analyzed, however, how many of such would remain who truly deserve the appellation of wise, even in terrestrial wisdom? How many, we ask, of the so-called authorities and leaders of men, would prove much better than those of whom it was said, by one, wise, indeed, they be blind leaders of the blind? That the teachings of neither our modern teachers nor preachers are wisdom from above is fully demonstrated. It is proved not by any personal incorrectness in their statements or mistakes in life, for to err is but human, but by incontrovertible facts. Wisdom and truth are synonymous terms, and that which is false or well-known representative of the Church of England, that the Sermon of the Mount would, in its practical application, mean utter ruin for his country less than 3 weeks. And if it is no less true, as asserted by a literary critic of science, that the knell of Charles Darwinism is rung in Mr. A. R. Wallace's present book, 35, an event already predicted by cataphages, then we are left to choose between two courses. We have either to take both theology and science on blind faith and trust, or to proclaim both untrue and untrustworthy. There is, however, a third course open, to pretend that we believe in both at the same time, and say nothing, as many do. But this would be sinning against theosophy and pandering to the prejudices of society, and that we refuse to do. More than this, we declare openly, quond meme, that not one of the two, neither theologist nor scientist, has the right in the face of this to claim, the one that he preaches that which is divine inspiration, and the other, exact science. Since the former enforces that, which is on his own recognition, pernicious to men and states, i.e. the ethics of Christ, and the other, in the person of the eminent naturalist, Mr. A. R. Wallace, as shown by Mr. Samuel Butler, teaches Darwinian evolution, in which he believes no longer, a scheme, moreover, which has never existed in nature, if the opponents of Darwinism are correct. Nevertheless, if anyone would presume to call unwise, or false, the world-chosen authorities, or declare their respective policies dishonest, he would find himself promptly reduced to silence. To doubt the exalted wisdom of the religion of the late Cardinal Newman, of the Church of England, or again of our great modern scientists, is to sin against the Holy Ghost and culture. Woe unto him who refuses to recognize the world's elect. He has to bow before one or the other, though, if one is true, the other must be false. And if the wisdom of neither bishop nor scientist is from above, which is pretty fairly demonstrated by this time, then their wisdom is at best terrestrial, psychic, devilish. Now our readers have to bear in mind that naught of the above is meant as a sign of disrespect for the true teachings of Christ, or true science, nor do we judge personalities but only the systems of our civilized world. Valuing freedom of thought above all things as the only way of reaching at some future time that wisdom, of which every theosophist ought to be enamored, we recognize the right to the same freedom in our foes as in our friends. All we contend for is their claim to wisdom, as we understand this term. Nor do we blame, but rather pity, in our innermost heart, the wise men of our age for trying to carry out the only policy that will keep them on the pinnacle of their authority. As they could not, if even they would, act otherwise and preserve their prestige with the masses, or escape from being speedily outcast by their colleagues. The party spirit is so strong with regard to the old tracks and ruts, that to turn on a side path means deliberate treachery to it. Thus, to be regarded nowadays as an authority in some particular subject, the scientist has to reject nolens volens the metaphysical, and the theologian to show contempt for the materialistic teachings. All this is worldly policy and practical common sense, but it is not the wisdom of either Job or James. Shall it be then regarded as too far-fetched, if, basing our words on a lifelong observation and experience, we venture to offer our ideas as to the quickest and most efficient means of obtaining our present world's universal respect and becoming an authority? Show the tender regard for the corns of every party's hobbies, and offer yourself as the chief executioner, the hangman, of the reputations of men and things regarded as unpopular. Learn that the great secret of power consists in the art of pandering to popular prejudices, to the world's likes and dislikes. Once this principal condition complied with, he who practices it is certain of attracting to himself the educated and their satellites, the less educated, they whose rule it is to place themselves invariably on the safe side of public opinion. This will lead to a perfect harmony or simultaneous action. For, while the favorite attitude of the cultured is to hide behind the intellectual bulwarks of the favorite leaders of scientific thought, and jurare in verba magistri, that of the less cultured is to transform themselves into the faithful mechanical telephones of their superiors, and to repeat like well-trained parrots the dicta of their immediate leaders. The now aphoristical precept of Mr. Artemus Ward, the showman of famous memory, "Scratch my back, Mr. Editor, and I will scratch yours," proves immortally true. The rising star, whether he be a theologian, a politician, an author, a scientist, or a journalist, has to begin scratching the back of public tastes and prejudices, a hypnotic method as old as human vanity. Gradually the hypnotized masses begin to purr, they are ready for suggestion. Suggest whatever you want them to believe, and forthwith they will begin to return your caresses, and purr now to your hobbies, and pander in their turn to anything suggested by theologian, politician, author, scientist, or journalist. Such is the simple secret of blossoming into an authority or a leader of men, and such is the secret of our modern-day wisdom. And this is also the secret and the true reason of the unpopularity of Lucifer and of the ostracism practiced by this same modern world on the Theosophical Society, for neither Lucifer, nor the society it belongs to, has ever followed Mr. Artemus Ward's golden precept. No true theosophist, in fact, would consent to become the fetish of a fashionable doctrine, any more than he would make himself the slave of a decaying dead-letter system, the spirit from which has disappeared forever. Neither would he pander to anyone or anything, and therefore would always decline to show belief in that in which he does not, nor can he believe, which is lying to his own soul. Therefore there, where others see the beauty and graces of modern culture, the theosophist sees only moral ugliness and the somersaults of the clowns of the so-called cultured centers. For him nothing applies better to modern fashionable society than Sidney Smith's description of popish ritualism, posture and imposture, flexions and genuflexions, bowing to the right, curtsying to the left. And an immense amount of male, and especially female, millinery. There may be, no doubt, for some worldly minds, a great charm in modern civilization, but for the theosophist all its bounties can hardly repay for the evils it has brought on the world. These are so many, that it is not within the limits of this article to enumerate these offspring of culture and of the progress of physical science, whose latest achievements begin with vivisection and end in improved murder by electricity. Our answer, we have no doubt, is not calculated to make us more friends than enemies, but but this can be hardly helped. Our magazine may be looked upon as pessimistic, but no one can charge it with publishing slanders or lies, or, in fact, anything but that which we honestly believe to be true. Be it as it may, however, we hope never to lack moral courage in the expression of our opinions or in defense of theosophy and its society. Let then 9/10 of every population arise in arms against the Theosophical Society wherever it appears, they will never be able to suppress the truths it utters. Let the masses of growing materialism, the hosts of spiritualism, all the church-going congregations, bigots and iconoclasts, Grundy worshippers, aping followers and blind disciples, let them slander, abuse, lie, denounce, and publish every falsehood about us under the sun. They will not uproot theosophy, nor even upset her society, if only its members hold together. Let even such friends and advisers as he who is now answered, turn away in disgust from those whom he addresses in vain. It matters not, for our two paths in life run diametrically opposite. Let him keep to his terrestrial wisdom, we will keep to that pure ray that comes from above, from the light of the ancient. What indeed has wisdom, Theosophia, the wisdom, full of mercy and good fruits, without wrangling or partiality and without hypocrisy, James 3:17, to do with our cruel, selfish, crafty, and hypocritical world? What is there in common between divine Sophia and the improvements of modern civilization and science, between spirit and the letter that killeth? The more so as at this stage of evolution the wisest man on earth, according to the wise Carlyle, is but a clever infant spelling letters from a hieroglyphical, prophetic book, the lexicon of which lies in eternity. The esoteric character of the Gospels. Part 1. Tell us, when shall these things be? And what shall be the sign of thy presence, and of the consummation of the age? 36 asked the disciples of the Master, on the Mount of Olives. The reply given by the man of sorrow, the Christos, on his trial, but also on his way to triumph, as Christos, or Christ 37, is prophetic, and very suggestive. It is a warning indeed. The answer must be quoted in full. Jesus said unto them, Take heed that no man lead you astray. For many shall come in my name saying, I am the Christ, and shall lead many astray. And ye shall hear of wars. But the end is not yet. For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines and earthquakes in divers places. But all these things are the beginning of travail. Many false prophets shall arise, and shall lead many astray. Then shall the end come. When ye see the abomination of desolation which was spoken through Daniel. Then if any man shall say unto you, Lo, here is the Christ, or there, believe him not. If they shall say unto you, Behold, he is in the wilderness, go not forth, behold, he is in the inner chambers, believe them not. For as the lightning cometh forth from the east, and is seen even in the west, so shall be the presence of the Son of Man, etc., etc. Two things become evident to all in the above passages, now that their false rendering is corrected in the revision text. A. The coming of Christ, means the presence of Christos in a regenerated world. And not at all the actual coming in body of Christ Jesus. B. This Christ is to be sought neither in the wilderness nor in the inner chambers, nor in the sanctuary of any temple or church built by man, for Christ, the true esoteric Savior, is no man, but the divine principle in every human being. He who strives to resurrect the spirit crucified in him by his own terrestrial passions, and buried deep in the sepulchre of his sinful flesh. He who has the strength to roll back the stone of matter from the door of his own inner sanctuary, he has the risen Christ in him. 38 The Son of Man is no child of the bondwoman, flesh, but verily of the free woman, spirit. 39 The child of man's own deeds, and the fruit of his own spiritual labor. On the other hand, at no time since the Christian era, have the precursor signs described in Matthew applied so graphically and forcibly to any epoch as they do to our own times. When has nation arisen against nation more than at this time? When have famines, another name for destitute pauperism, and the famished multitudes of the proletariat, been more cruel, earthquakes more frequent, or covered such an area simultaneously, as for the last few years? Millenarians and Adventists of robust faith may go on saying that the coming of the canalized Christ is near at hand, and prepare themselves for the end of the world. Theosophists, at any rate, some of them, who understand the hidden meaning of the universally expected avatars, messiahs, Sosiashes and Christs, know that it is no end of the world, but the consummation of the age, i.e., the close of a cycle, which is now fast approaching. 40. If our readers have forgotten the concluding passages of the article, The Signs of the Times, 41 in Lucifer for October last, let them read them over, and they will plainly see the meaning of this particular cycle. Many and many a time the warning about the false Christs and prophets who shall lead people astray has been interpreted by charitable Christians, the worshippers of the dead letter of their scripture, as applying to mystics generally, and theosophists most especially. The recent work by Mr. Pember, Earth's Earliest Ages, is a proof of it. Nevertheless, it seems very evident that the words in Matthew's Gospel and others can hardly apply to theosophists. For these were never found saying that Christ is here or there, in wilderness or city, and least of all in the inner chamber behind the altar of any modern church. Whether heathen or Christian by birth, they refuse to materialize and thus degrade that which is the purest and grandest ideal, the symbol of symbols, namely, the immortal divine spirit in man, whether it be called Horus, Krishna, Buddha, or Christ. None of them has ever yet said, I am the Christ, for those born in the West feel themselves, so far, only Christians 42, however much they may strive to become Christians in spirit. It is to those, who in their great conceit and pride refuse to win the right of such appellation by first leading the life of Christos 43. To those who haughtily proclaim themselves Christians, the glorified, the anointed, by sole virtue of baptism when but a few days old, that the above-quoted words of Jesus apply most forcibly. Can the prophetic insight of him who uttered this remarkable warning be doubted by anyone who sees the numerous false prophets and pseudo-apostles of Christ now roaming over the world? These have split the one divine truth into fragments, and broken, in the camp of the Protestants alone, the rock of the eternal verity into 350-odd pieces, which now represent the bulk of their dissenting sects. Accepting the number in round figures as 350, and admitting, for argument's sake, that, at least, one of these may have the approximate truth, still 349 must be necessarily false. 44. Each of these claims to have Christ exclusively in its inner chamber, and denies him to all others, while, in truth, the great majority of their respective followers daily put Christ to death on the cruciform tree of matter, the tree of infamy of the old Romans, indeed. The worship of the dead letter in the Bible is but one more form of idolatry, nothing better. A fundamental dogma of faith cannot exist under a double-faced Janus form. Justification by Christ cannot be achieved at one's choice and fancy, either by faith or by works in James, therefore, 2:25, contradicting Paul, Heb 11:31, and vice versa 45, one of them must be wrong. Hence, the Bible is not the Word of God, but contains at best the words of fallible men and imperfect teachers. Yet read esoterically, it does contain, if not the whole truth, still, nothing but the truth, under whatever allegorical garb. Only, quod homines tot sententiae. The Christ principle, the awakened and glorified Spirit of truth, being universal and eternal, the true Christos cannot be monopolized by any one person, even though that person has chosen to arrogate to himself the title of the Vicar of Christ, or of the head of that or another state religion. The spirits of Christ and Christ cannot be confined to any creed or sect, only because that sect chooses to exalt itself above the heads of all other religions or sects. The name has been used in a manner so intolerant and dogmatic, especially in our day, that Christianity is now the religion of arrogance par excellence, a stepping stone for ambition, a sinecure for wealth, sham and power, a convenient screen for hypocrisy. The noble epithet of old, the one that made Justin Martyr say that, from the mere name, which is imputed to us as a crime, we are the most excellent, 46 is now degraded. The missionary prides himself with the so-called conversion of a heathen, who makes of Christianity ever a profession, but rarely a religion, a source of income from the missionary fund, and a pretext. Since the blood of Jesus has washed them all by anticipation, for every petty crime, from drunkenness and lying up to theft. That same missionary, however, would not hesitate to publicly condemn the greatest saint to eternal perdition and hell fires if that holy man has only neglected to pass through the fruitless and meaningless form of baptism by water with accompaniment of lip prayers and vain ritualism. We say lip prayer and vain ritualism knowingly. Few Christians among the laymen are aware even of the true meaning of the word Christ. And those of the clergy who happen to know it, for they are brought up in the idea that to study such subjects is sinful, keep the information secret from their parishioners. They demand blind, implicit faith, and forbid inquiry as the one unpardonable sin, though nothing of that which leads to the knowledge of the truth can be aught else than holy. For what is divine wisdom, or gnosis, but the essential reality behind the evanescent appearances of objects in nature, the very soul of the manifested logos? Why should men who strive to accomplish union with the one eternal and absolute deity shudder at the idea of prying into its mysteries, however awful? Why, above all, should they use names and words the very meaning of which is a sealed mystery to them a mere sound? Is it because an unscrupulous, power-seeking establishment called a church has cried wolf at every such attempt, and, denouncing it as blasphemous, has ever tried to kill the spirit of inquiry? But theosophy, that divine wisdom, has never heeded that cry, and has the courage of its opinions. The world of skeptics and fanatics may call it, one, an empty ism, the other, Satanism, they can never crush it. Theosophists have been called atheists, haters of Christianity, the enemies of God and the gods. They are none of these. Therefore, they have agreed this day to publish a clear statement of their ideas, and a profession of their faith, with regard to monotheism and Christianity. At any rate, and to place it before the impartial reader to judge them and their detractors on the merits of their respective faiths. No truth-loving mind would object to such honest and sincere dealing, nor will it be dazzled by any amount of new light thrown upon the subject, howsoever much startled otherwise. On the contrary, such minds will thank Lucifer, perhaps, while those of whom it was said, "Que vult decipi decipiator," let them be deceived by all means. The editors of this magazine propose to give a series of essays upon the hidden meaning or esotericism of the New Testament. No more than any other scripture of the great world religions can the Bible be excluded from that class of allegorical and symbolical writings which have been, from the prehistoric ages, the receptacle of the secret teachings of the mysteries of initiation, under a more or less veiled form. The primitive writers of the Logia, now the Gospels, knew certainly the truth, and the whole truth. But their successors had, as certainly, only dogma and form, which lead to hierarchical power at heart, rather than the spirit of the so-called Christ's teachings. Hence the gradual perversion. As Higgins truly said, in the Christologia of St. Paul and Justin Martyr, we have the esoteric religion of the Vatican, a refined Gnosticism for the cardinals, a more gross one for the people. It is the latter, only still more materialized and disfigured, which has reached us in our age. The idea of writing this series was suggested to us by a certain letter published in our October issue, under the heading of, "Are the Teachings Ascribed to Jesus Contradictory?" Nevertheless, this is no attempt to contradict or weaken, in any one instance, that which is said by Mr. Gerald Massey in his criticism. The contradictions pointed out by the learned lecturer and author are too patent to be explained by any preacher or Bible champion. For what he has said, only in more terse and vigorous language, is what was said of the descendant of Joseph Pandira, or Panthera, in Isis Unveiled, Volume 2, page 201, from the Talmudic Sefer Toldos Jeshu. His belief with regard to the spurious character of the Bible and New Testament, as now edited, is therefore, also the belief of the present writer. In view of the recent revision of the Bible, and its many thousands of mistakes, mistranslations, and interpolations, some confessed to, and others withheld, It would ill become an opponent to take anyone to task for refusing to believe in the authorized texts. But the editors would object to one short sentence in the criticism under notice. Mr. Gerald Massey writes, "What is the use of taking your Bible oath that the thing is true, if the book you are sworn upon is a magazine of falsehoods already exploded, or just going off? Surely it is not a symbologist of Mr. Massey's powers and learning who would call the Book of the Dead, or the Vedas, or any other ancient scripture, a magazine of falsehoods. 47 Why not regard in the same light as all the others, the Old, and, in a still greater measure, the New Testament? All of these are magazines of falsehoods, if accepted in the exoteric dead-letter interpretations of their ancient, and especially their modern, theological glossarists. Each of these records has served in its turn as a means for securing power and of supporting the ambitious policy of an unscrupulous priesthood. All have promoted superstition, all made of their gods bloodthirsty and ever-damning Molochs and fiends, as all have made nations to serve the latter more than the God of truth. But while cunningly devised dogmas and intentional misinterpretations by scholiasts are beyond any doubt, falsehoods already exploded, the texts themselves are mines of universal truths. But for the world of the profane and sinners, at any rate, they were and still are like the mysterious characters traced by the fingers of a man's hand on the wall of the palace of Belshazzar. They needed Daniel to read and understand them. Nevertheless, truth has not allowed herself to remain without witnesses. There are, besides great initiates into scriptural symbology, a number of quiet students of the mysteries or archaic esotericism, of scholars proficient in Hebrew and other dead tongues, who have devoted their lives to unriddle the speeches of the Sphinx of the world religions. And these students, though none of them has yet mastered all the 7 keys that open the great problem, have discovered enough to be able to say, there was a universal mystery language, in which all the world scriptures were written. From Vedas to Revelation, from the Book of the Dead to the Acts. One of the keys, at any rate, the numerical and geometrical key 48 to the mystery speech is now rescued. An ancient language, truly, which up to this time remained hidden, but the evidences of which abundantly exist, as may be proven by undeniable mathematical demonstrations. If, indeed, the Bible is forced on the acceptance of the world in its dead-letter meaning, in the face of the modern discoveries by Orientalists and the efforts of independent students and Kabbalists, it is easy to prophesy that even the present new generations of Europe and America will repudiate it, as all the materialists and logicians have done. For, the more one studies ancient religious texts, the more one finds that the groundwork of the New Testament is the same as the groundwork of the Vedas, of the Egyptian theogony, and the Mazdean allegories. The atonements by blood, blood covenants and blood transferences from gods to men, and by men, as sacrifices to the gods, are the first keynote struck in every cosmogony and theogony. Soul, life and blood were synonymous words in every language, preeminently with the Jews, and that blood-giving was life-giving. Many a legend among, geographically, alien nations ascribe soul and consciousness in newly created mankind to the blood of the God-creators. Berosus records a Chaldean legend ascribing the creation of a new race of mankind to the admixture of dust with the blood that flowed from the severed head of the god Belus. On this account it is that men are rational and partake of divine knowledge, explains Berosus. 49 and Lenormand has shown, Beginnings of History, page 52, note, that, the Orphics said that the immaterial part of man, his soul, his life, sprang from the blood of Dionysius Zagreus, whom Titans tore to pieces. Blood revivifies the dead, i.e. interpreted metaphysically, it gives conscious life and a soul to the man of matter or clay, such as the modern materialist is now. The mystic meaning of the injunction, verily I say unto you, except ye eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, ye have not life in yourselves, etc., can never be understood or appreciated at its true occult value, except by those who hold some of the 7 keys, and yet care little for St. Peter. 50 These words, whether said by Jesus of Nazareth, or Jeshua ben Panthera, are the words of an initiate. They have to be interpreted with the help of 3 keys, one opening the psychic door, the second that of physiology, and the third that which unlocks the mystery of terrestrial being. By unveiling the inseparable blending of theogony with anthropology. It is for revealing a few of these truths, with the sole view of saving intellectual mankind from the insanities of materialism and pessimism, that mystics have often been denounced as the servants of Antichrist. Even by those Christians who are most worthy, sincerely pious and respectable men. The first key that one has to use to unravel the dark secrets involved in the mystic name of Christ, is the key which unlocked the door to the ancient mysteries of the primitive Aryans, Sabaeans and Egyptians. The gnosis supplanted by the Christian scheme was universal. It was the echo of the primordial wisdom religion which had once been the heirloom of the whole of mankind. And, therefore, one may truly say that, in its purely metaphysical aspect, the Spirit of Christ, the divine Logos, was present in humanity from the beginning of it. The author of the Clementine Homilies is right. The mystery of Christos, now supposed to have been taught by Jesus of Nazareth, was identical with that which from the first had been communicated to those who were worthy, as quoted in another lecture. 51. We may learn from the Gospel according to Luke, that the worthy were those who had been initiated into the mysteries of the Gnosis, and who were accounted worthy to attain that resurrection from the dead in this life. Those who knew that they could die no more, being equal to the angels as sons of God and sons of the resurrection. In other words, they were the great adepts of whatever religion. And the words apply to all those who, without being initiates, strive and succeed, through personal efforts to live the life and to attain the naturally ensuing spiritual illumination in blending their personality, the Son, with the Father. Their individual divine spirit, the God within them. This resurrection can never be monopolized by the Christians, but is the spiritual birthright of every human being endowed with soul and spirit, whatever his religion may be. Such individual is a Christ man. On the other hand, those who choose to ignore the Christ principle within themselves must die unregenerate heathens, baptism, sacraments, lip prayers, and belief in dogmas notwithstanding. In order to follow this explanation, the reader must bear in mind the real archaic meaning of the paronomasia involved in the two terms Christos and Christos. The former means certainly more than merely a good and excellent man, while the latter was never applied to any one living man, but to every initiate at the moment of his second birth and resurrection. 52. He who finds Christos within himself and recognizes the latter as his only way, becomes a follower and an apostle of Christ, though he may have never been baptized, nor even have met a Christian, still less call himself one. Part 2. The word Christos existed ages before Christianity was heard of. It is found used, from the 5th century BC, by Herodotus, by Aeschylus and other classical Greek writers, the meaning of it being applied to both things and persons. Thus in Aeschylus, Cho. 901, we read of Pythocresta, the oracles delivered by a Pythian god, Greek-English lexicon, through a Pythoness, and Pythocrestos is the nominative singular of an adjective derived from Creo, Europe. Ion, 1218. The later meanings coined freely from this primitive application, are numerous and varied. Pagan classics expressed more than one idea by the verb, kreomai, consulting an oracle. For it also means, fated, doomed by an oracle, in the sense of a sacrificial victim to its decree, or, to the word, as Christerion is not only the seed of an oracle but also an offering to, or for, the oracle. 53. Crests is one who expounds or explains oracles, a prophet, a soothsayer. 54. And Christerios is one who belongs to, or is in the service of, an oracle, a god, or a master. 55. This canon Farrar's efforts notwithstanding. 56. All this is evidence that the terms Christ and Christians, spelt originally Crest and Christians, Christianoi, 57 were directly borrowed from the temple terminology of the pagans, and meant the same thing. The God of the Jews was now substituted for the oracle and the other gods. The generic designation, Christos, became a noun applied to one special personage. And new terms such as Christianoi and Christodolos, a follower or servant of Christos, were coined out of the old material. This is shown by Philo Judaeus, a monotheist, assuredly, using already the same term for monotheistic purposes. For he speaks of Theokrestos, God declared, or one who is declared by God, and of Logia Theokresta, sayings delivered by God, which proves that he wrote at a time, between the 1st century B.C., and the 1st A.D. when neither Christians nor Christians were yet known under these names, but still called themselves the Nazarenes. The notable difference between the two words, kreo, consulting or obtaining response from a god or oracle, kreo being the Ionic earlier form of it, and cryo, to rub, to anoint, from which the name Christos, has not prevented the ecclesiastical adoption and coin age from Philo's expression, Theokrestos, of that other term, Theokristos, anointed by God. Thus the quiet substitution of the letter a for e, for dogmatic purposes, was achieved in the easiest way, as we now see. The secular meaning of Krestos runs throughout the classical Greek literature pari passu with that given to it in the Mysteries. Demosthenes' saying, O Crest, 330:27, means by it simply, you nice fellow, Plato, in Phod. 264b, has, Krestos ei hodi hegii, you are an excellent fellow to think. But in the esoteric phraseology of the temples, Krestos, 58 a word which, like the participle Krestius, is formed under the same rule, and conveys the same sense, from the verb, kreomai, to consult a god, answers to what we would call an adept, also a high chela, a disciple. It is in this sense that it is used by Euripides, Ion. 1320, and by Aeschylus, L.C. This qualification was applied to those whom the god, oracle, or any superior had proclaimed this, that, or anything else. An instance may be given in this case. The words, Kresin oikistra, used by Pindar, pages 4-10, mean, the oracle proclaimed him the colonizer. In this case the genius of the Greek language permits that the man so proclaimed should be called Krestos. Hence this term was applied to every disciple recognized by a master, as also to every good man. Now, the Greek language affords strange etymologies. Christian theology has chosen and decreed that the name Christos should be taken as derived from, cryo, chryso, anointed with scented unguents or oil. But this word has several significances. It is used by Homer, certainly, as applied to the rubbing with oil of the body after bathing, il. 23, 186, also in OD, 4, 252, as other ancient writers do. Yet the word Christs means rather a whitewasher, while the word crests means priest and prophet, a term far more applicable to Jesus, than that of the anointed, since, as Nork shows on the authority of the Gospels, he never was anointed, either as king or priest. In short, there is a deep mystery underlying all this scheme, which, as I maintain, only a thorough knowledge of the pagan mysteries is capable of unveiling. 59 It is not what the early fathers, who had an object to achieve, may affirm or deny, that is the important point. But rather what is now the evidence for the real significance given to the two terms Krestos and Christos by the ancients in the pre-Christian ages. For the latter had no object to achieve, therefore nothing to conceal or disfigure, and their evidence is naturally the more reliable of the two. This evidence can be obtained by first studying the meaning given to these words by the classics, and then their correct significance searched for in mystic symbology. Now Krestos, as already said, is a term applied in various senses. It qualifies both deity and man. It is used in the former sense in the Gospels, and in Luke 6:35, where it means, kind, and merciful. Krestos est in ap2, in 1 Peter 2:3, where it is said, kind is the Lord, Krestos o Kyrios. On the other hand, it is explained by Clemens Alexandrinus as simply meaning a good man, i.e. all who believe in Christ, a good man, both are, and are called Christians, that is good men. Strom. Lib 2. The reticence of Clemens, whose Christianity, as King truly remarks in his Gnostics, was no more than a graft upon the congenial stock of his original Platonism, is quite natural. He was an initiate, a new Platonist, before he became a Christian, which fact, however much he may have fallen off from his earlier views, could not exonerate him from his pledge of secrecy. And as a theosophist and a Gnostic, one who knew, Clemens must have known that Christos was the way, while Christos was the lonely traveler journeying on to reach the ultimate goal through that path, which goal was Christos. The glorified spirit of truth, the reunion with which makes the soul, the Son, one with the Father, Spirit. That Paul knew it, is certain, for his own expressions prove it. For what do the words, Palin Odino, Akris ou morphothei Christos, or as given in the authorized translations, I am again in travail until Christ be formed in you, mean, but what we give in its esoteric rendering, i.e. until you find the Christos within yourselves as your only way. Vide Galatians 4:19 and 20. Thus Jesus, whether of Nazareth or Lud 60, was a Christos, as undeniably as that he never was entitled to the appellation of Christos, during his lifetime and before his last trial. It may have been as Higgins thinks, who surmises that the first name of Jesus was, perhaps, Christos, the second, Christos, and the third, Christos. The word, Christos, was in use before the eta was in the language. But Taylor, in his answer to Pye Smith, page 113, is quoted saying, the complementary epithet Crest signified nothing more than a good man. Here again a number of ancient writers may be brought forward to testify that Christos, or Christos, rather, was, along with Christos, equals Christos, an adjective applied to Gentiles before the Christian era. In Philopatris it is said, ei tukoi Christos kai en ethnicin, i.e., if Christos chanced to be even among the Gentiles, etc. Tertullian denounces in the 3rd chapter of his Apologia the word Christianus, as derived by crafty interpretation, 61. Dar. Jones, on the other hand, letting out the information, corroborated by good sources, that Christos was the name given to Christ by the Gnostics, and even by unbelievers. Assures us that the real name ought to be, Christos, or Christos, thus repeating and supporting the original, pious fraud of the early fathers, a fraud which led to the carnalizing of the whole Christian system. 62 But I propose to show as much of the real meaning of all these terms as lies within my humble powers and knowledge. Christos, or the Christ condition, was ever the synonym of the Mahatmic condition, i.e. the union of the man with the divine principle in him. As Paul says, Fs 3:17, Katoikasai ton Christendia tes pistios en tis cardiais human. That you may find Christos in your inner man through knowledge, not faith, as translated. For pistis is knowledge, as will be shown further on. There is still another and far more weighty proof that the name Christos is pre-Christian. The evidence for it is found in the prophecy of the Erythraean Sibyl. We read it in, Isis Christos Theou Huios Soter Storos. Read esoterically, this string of meaningless detached nouns, which has no sense to the profane, contains a real prophecy, only not referring to Jesus, and a verse from the mystic catechism of the initiate. The prophecy relates to the coming down upon the earth of the Spirit of Truth, Christos, after which advent, that has once more not to do with Jesus, will begin the Golden Age. The verse refers to the necessity before reaching that blessed condition of inner, or subjective, theophany and theopneusty, to pass through the crucifixion of flesh or matter. Read exoterically, the words Isis Christos Theos Soter Storos, meaning literally, Jesus, Christos, God, Son, Savior, Cross, are most excellent handles to hang a Christian prophecy on, but they are pagan, not Christian. If called upon to explain the names Isis Christos, the answer is, study mythology, the so-called fictions of the ancients, and they will give you the key. Ponder over Apollo, the solar god, and the healer, and the allegory about his son Janus, or Ion, his priest at Delphos, through whom alone could prayers reach the immortal gods, and his other son Asclepios, called the Soter, or Savior. Here is a leaflet from esoteric history written in symbolical phraseology by the old Grecian poets. The city of Chrysa 63, now spelt Crisa, was built in memory of Creusa, or Creusa, daughter of King Erechteus and mother of Janus, or Ion, by Apollo, in memory of the danger which Janus escaped. 64 We learn that Janus, abandoned by his mother in a grotto to hide the shame of the virgin who bore a son, was found by Hermes, who brought the infant to Delphi, nurtured him by his father's sanctuary and oracle, where, under the name of Croesus, Janus became first a Crestus, a priest, soothsayer, or initiate, and then very nearly a Christerion, a sacrificial victim, 65 ready to be poisoned by his own mother who knew him not, and who, in her jealousy, mistook him, on the hazy intimation of the oracle, for a son of her husband. He pursued her to the very altar with the intention of killing her, when she was saved through the Pythoness, who divulged to both the secret of their relationship. In memory of this narrow escape, Creusa, the mother, built the city of Chrysa, or Crisa. Such is the allegory, and it symbolizes simply the trials of initiation. 66. Finding then that Janus, the solar god, and son of Apollo, the sun, means the initiator, and the opener of the gate of light, or secret wisdom of the mysteries. That he is born from Crisa, esoterically Chris, and that he was a Crestos through whom spoke the god. That he was finally Ion, the father of the Ionians, and, some say, an aspect of Asclepios, another son of Apollo. It is easy to get hold of the thread of Ariadne in this labyrinth of allegories. It is not the place here to prove side issues in mythology, however. It suffices to show the connection between the mythical characters of hoary antiquity and the later fables that marked the beginning of our era of civilization. Asclepios, Aesculapius, was the divine physician, the healer, the savior, Soter, as he was called, a title also given to Janus of Delphi. And Iaso, the daughter of Asclepios, was the goddess of healing, under whose patronage were all the candidates for initiation in her father's temple, the novices or Crestoi, called the sons of Iaso. Vide for name, Plutus, by Aristoph. 701. Now, if we remember, firstly, that the names of Iasus in their different forms, such as Iasius, Iasian, Jason and Iasus, were very common in ancient Greece, especially among the descendants of Jasius, the Jassides. As also the number of the sons of Iaso, the Mistoi and future Apoptai, initiates, why should not the enigmatical words in the Sibylline book be read in their legitimate light, one that had naught to do with a Christian prophecy? The secret doctrine teaches that the first two words, Isis Christos, mean simply, son of Iaso, a Crestos, or servant of the oracular god. Indeed Iaso is in the Ionic dialect Ieso, and the expression Isis, in its archaic form, Isis, simply means, the son of Iaso or Yiso, the healer, i.e., Ho Isis, Uios. No objection, assuredly, can be taken to such rendering, or to the name being written Yiso instead of Iaso, since the first form is Attic, therefore incorrect, for the name is Ionic. Yiso, from which Ho Isis, son of Yiso, i.e. a genitive, not a nominative, is Ionic and cannot be anything else, if the age of the Sibylline book is taken into consideration. Nor could the Sibyl of Erythrea have spelt it originally otherwise, as Erythrea, her very residence, was a town in Ionia, from Ion or Janus, opposite Chios, and that the Ionic preceded the Attic form. Leaving aside in this case the mystical signification of the now famous Sibylline sentence, and giving its literal interpretation only, on the authority of all that has been said, the hitherto mysterious words would stand. Son of Iaso, Crestos, the priest or servant, of the son of the god, Apollo, the Savior from the cross, of flesh or matter. 67 Truly, Christianity can never hope to be understood until every trace of dogmatism is swept away from it, and the dead letter sacrificed to the eternal spirit of truth, which is Horus, which is Krishna, which is Buddha. As much as it is the Gnostic Christos and the true Christ of Paul. In the Travels of Dr. Clarke, the author describes a heathen monument found by him. Within the sanctuary, behind the altar, we saw the fragments of a marble cathedra, upon the back of which we found the following inscription, exactly as it is here written, no part of it having been injured or obliterated. affording perhaps the only instance known of a sepulchral inscription upon a monument of this remarkable form. The inscription ran thus: Christos Protos Thessalos Larisios Pelasgiotes Eton IH, or, Christos, the first, a Thessalonian from Larissa, Pelasgiot 18 years old hero. Christos the first, Protos, y. Read literally. The inscription has little sense, interpreted esoterically, it is pregnant with meaning. As Dr. Clark shows, the word Christos is found on the epitaphs of almost all the ancient Lauritians, but it is preceded always by a proper name. Had the adjective Christos stood after a name, it would only mean, a good man, a posthumous compliment paid to the defunct, the same being often found on our modern tumular epitaphs. But the word Christos, standing alone, and the other word, Protos, following it, gives it quite another meaning, especially when the deceased is specified as a hero. To the mind of an occultist, the defunct was a neophyte, who had died in his 18th year of neophytism 68, and stood in the first or highest class of discipleship, having passed his preliminary trials as a hero. But had died before the last mystery, which would have made of him a Christos, an anointed, one with the spirit of Christos or truth in him. He had not reached the end of the way, though he had heroically conquered the horrors of the preliminary theurgic trials. We are quite warranted in reading it in this manner, after learning the place where Dr. Clark discovered the tablet, which was, as Godfrey Higgins remarks, there, where I should expect to find it, at Delphi, in the temple of the God i.e., who, with the Christians became Jah, or Jehovah, one with Christ Jesus. It was at the foot of Parnassus, in a gymnasium, adjoining the Castalian fountain, which flowed by the ruins of Crisa, probably the town called Crestona, etc. And again, in the first part of its course from the Castalian fountain, the river, separates the remains of the gymnasium from the valley of Castro, as it probably did from the old city of Delphi, the seat of the great oracle of Apollo, of the town of Crisa, or Creusa, the great center of initiations and of the Crestoi of the decrees of the oracles, where the candidates for the last labor were anointed with sacred oils 69 before being plunged into their last trance of 49 hours duration, as to this day, in the East, from which they arose as glorified adepts or Christoi. In the Clementine recognitions it is announced that the Father anointed his Son with oil that was taken from the wood of the tree of life, and from this anointing he is called the Christ, whence the Christian name. This again is Egyptian. Horus was the anointed Son of the Father. The mode of anointing him from the tree of life, portrayed on the monuments, is very primitive indeed. And the Horus of Egypt was continued in the Gnostic Christ, who is reproduced upon the Gnostic stones as the intermediate link betwixt the Charist and the Christ, also as the Horus of both sexes. The name and nature of the Christ. Gerald Massey. Mr. G. Massey connects the Greek Christos or Christ with the Egyptian Charist, the mummy type of immortality, and proves it very thoroughly. He begins by saying that in Egyptian the word of truth is Ma-Keru, and that it is the title of Horus. Thus, as he shows, Horus preceded Christ as the messenger of the word of truth, the Logos or the manifester of the divine nature in humanity. In the same paper he writes as follows. The Gnosis had three phases, astronomical, spiritual, and doctrinal, and all three can be identified with the Christ of Egypt. In the astronomical phase the constellation Orion is called the Sahu or mummy. The soul of Horus was represented as rising from the dead and ascending to heaven in the stars of Orion. The mummy image was the preserved one, the saved, therefore a portrait of the Savior, as a type of immortality. This was the figure of a dead man, which, as Plutarch and Herodotus tell us, was carried round at an Egyptian banquet, when the guests were invited to look on it and eat and drink and be happy, because, when they died, they would become what the image symbolized, that is, they also would be immortal. This type of immortality was called the Charist, or Charist, and it was the Egyptian Christ. To Charis means to embalm, anoint, to make the mummy as a type of the eternal, and, when made, it was called the Charist. So that this is not merely a matter of name for name, the Charist for the Christ. This image of the Charist was bound up in a woof without a seam, the proper vesture of the Christ. No matter what the length of the bandage might be, and some of the mummy swathes have been unwound that were 1,000 yards in length, the woof was from beginning to end without a seam. Now, this seamless robe of the Egyptian Kerist is a very telltale type of the mystical Christ, who becomes historic in the Gospels as the wearer of a coat or chiton, made without a seam, which neither the Greek nor the Hebrew fully explains. But which is explained by the Egyptian kedu for the woof, and by the seamless robe or swathing without seam that was made for eternal wear, and worn by the mummy Christ, the image of immortality in the tombs of Egypt. Further, Jesus is put to death in accordance with the instructions given for making the Kerist. Not a bone must be broken. The true Kerist must be perfect in every member. This is he who comes out sound, whom men know not is his name. In the Gospels Jesus rises again with every member sound, like the perfectly preserved Kerist, to demonstrate the physical resurrection of the mummy. But, in the Egyptian original, the mummy transforms. The deceased says, I am spiritualized. I am become a soul. I rise as a god. This transformation into the spiritual image, the Ka, has been omitted in the Gospel. This spelling of the name as crest or crest in Latin is supremely important, because it enables me to prove the identity with the Egyptian Kerist or Kerist, the name of the Christ as the embalmed mummy. Which was the image of the resurrection in Egyptian tombs, the type of immortality, the likeness of the Horus, who rose again and made the pathway out of the sepulchre for those who were his disciples or followers. Moreover, this type of the Kerist or mummy Christ is reproduced in the catacombs of Rome. No representation of the supposed historic resurrection of Jesus has been found on any of the early Christian monuments. But, instead of the missing fact, we find the scene of Lazarus being raised from the dead. This is depicted over and over again as the typical resurrection where there is no real one. The scene is not exactly in accordance with the rising from the grave in the Gospel. It is purely Egyptian, and Lazarus is an Egyptian mummy. Thus Lazarus, in each representation, is the mummy type of the resurrection. Lazarus is the Kerist, who was the Egyptian Christ, and who is reproduced by Gnostic art in the catacombs of Rome as a form of the Gnostic Christ, who was not and could not become an historical character. Further, as the thing is Egyptian, it is probable that the name is derived from Egyptian. If so, Laz, equal to Ras, means to be raised up, while Aru is the mummy by name. With the Greek terminal s this becomes Lazarus. In the course of humanizing the mythos, the typical representation of the resurrection found in the tombs of Rome and Egypt would become the story of Lazarus being raised from the dead. This Kerist type of the Christ in the catacombs is not limited to Lazarus. By means of the Kerist type the Christ and the Christians can both be traced in the ancient tombs of Egypt. The mummy was made in this likeness of the Christ. It was the Christ by name, identical with the Krestoi of the Greek inscriptions. Thus the honored dead, who rose again as the followers of Horus Makaru, the word of truth, are found to be the Christians, on the Egyptian monuments. Makaru is the term that is always applied to the faithful ones who win the crown of life and wear it at the festival, which is designated, Come thou to me, an invitation by Horus the Justifier to those who are the blessed ones of his father. Osiris, they who, having made the word of truth the law of their lives, were the justified, hoi Krestoi, the Christians, on earth. In a 5th century representation of the Madonna and Child from the cemetery of St. Valentinus, the newborn babe lying in a box or crib is also the Kerist, or mummy type, further identified as the divine babe of the solar mythos by the disk of the sun and the cross of the equinox at the back of the infant's head. Thus the child Christ of the historic faith is born, and visibly begins in the Kerist image of the dead Christ, which was the mummy type of the resurrection in Egypt for thousands of years before the Christian era. This doubles the proof that the Christ of the Christian catacombs was a survival of the Kerist of Egypt. Moreover, as Didron shows, there was a portrait of the Christ who had his body painted red. 70 It was a popular tradition that the Christ was of a red complexion. This, too, may be explained as a survival of the mummy Christ. It was an aboriginal mode of rendering things tapu by coloring them red. The dead corpse was coated with red ochre, a very primitive mode of making the mummy, or the Anointed One. Thus the god Ta tells Ramesses II that he has refashioned his flesh in vermilion. This anointing with red ochre is called Kara by the Maori, who likewise made the Christ or Christ. We see the mummy image continued on another line of descent when we learn that among other pernicious heresies and deadly sins with which the Knights Templars were charged, was the impious custom of adoring a mummy that had red eyes. Their idol, called Baphomet, is also thought to have been a mummy. The mummy was the earliest human image of the Christ. I do not doubt that the ancient Roman festivals called the Charistia were connected in their origin with the Charist and the Eucharist as a celebration in honor of the manes of their departed kith and kin, for whose sakes they became reconciled at the friendly gathering once a year. It is here, then, we have to seek the essential connection between the Egyptian Christ, the Christians, and the Roman catacombs. These Christian mysteries, ignorantly explained to be inexplicable, can be explained by Gnosticism and mythology, but in no other way. It is not that they are insoluble by human reason, as their incompetent, howsoever highly paid, expounders nowadays pretend. That is but the puerile apology of the unqualified for their own helpless ignorance, they who have never been in possession of the gnosis or science of the mysteries by which alone these things can be explained in accordance with their natural genesis. In Egypt only can we read the matter to the root, or identify the origin of the Christ by nature and by name, to find at last that the Christ was the mummy type, and that our Christology is mummified mythology. Agnostic Annual. The above is an explanation on purely scientific evidence, but, perhaps, a little too materialistic, just because of that science, notwithstanding that the author is a well-known spiritualist. Occultism pure and simple finds the same mystic elements in the Christian as in other faiths, though it rejects as emphatically its dogmatic and historic character. It is a fact that in the terms, Isis ho Christos, see Acts v. 42, 9. 34. I Corinth. 3, 11, etc., the article, ho, designating Christos, proves it simply a surname, like that of Phocion, who is referred to as Phocion ho Christos, Plut. v. Still, the personage, Jesus, so addressed, whenever he lived, was a great initiate and a Son of God. For, we say it again, the surname Christos is based on, and the story of the crucifixion derived from, events that preceded it. Everywhere, in India as in Egypt, in Chaldea as in Greece, all these legends were built upon one and the same primitive type. The voluntary sacrifice of the Logoi, the rays of the one Logos, the direct manifested emanation from the one ever-concealed infinite and unknown, whose rays incarnated in mankind. They consented to fall into matter, and are, therefore, called the fallen ones. This is one of those great mysteries which can hardly be touched upon in a magazine article, but shall be noticed in a separate work of mine, The Secret Doctrine, very fully. Having said so much, a few more facts may be added to the etymology of the two terms. Christos, being the verbal adjective in Greek of cryo, to be rubbed on, as ointment or salve, and the word being finally brought to mean the Anointed One, in Christian theology. And Kri, in Sanskrit, the first syllable in the name of Krishna, meaning to pour out, or rub over, to cover with, 71 among many other things, this may lead one as easily to make of Krishna, the Anointed One. Christian philologists try to limit the meaning of Krishna's name to its derivation from Krish, black. But if the analogy and comparison of the Sanskrit with the Greek roots contained in the names of Christos, Christos, and Krishna, are analyzed more carefully, it will be found that they are all of the same origin. 72. In Baccha's Christian inscriptions, numbering 1287, there is no single instance of an earlier date than the 3rd century, wherein the name is not written Crest or Christ. The Name and Nature of the Christ, by G. Massey, The Agnostic Annual. Yet none of these names can be unriddled, as some Orientalists imagine, merely with the help of astronomy and the knowledge of zodiacal signs in conjunction with phallic symbols. Because, while the sidereal symbols of the mystic characters or personifications in Puranas or Bible fulfill astronomical functions, their spiritual antitypes rule invisibly, but very effectively, the world. They exist as abstractions on the higher plane, as manifested ideas on the astral, and become males, females and androgyne powers on this lower plane of ours. Scorpio, as Christos Meshiach, and Leo, as Christos Messiah, antedated by far the Christian era in the trials and triumphs of initiation during the mysteries, Scorpio standing as symbol for the latter. Leo for the glorified triumph of the Son of Truth. The mystic philosophy of the allegory is well understood by the author of The Source of Measures, who writes 1. Christos, causing himself to go down into the pit, of Scorpio, or incarnation in the womb, for the salvation of the world. This was the sun, shorn of his golden rays, and crowned with blackened 73 ones, symbolizing this loss, as the thorns. The other was the triumphant Messiah, mounted up to the summit of the arch of heaven, personated as the Lion of the tribe of Judah. In both instances he had the cross. Once in humiliation, as the son of copulation, and once holding it in his control, as the law of creation, he being Jehovah. In the scheme of the authors of dogmatic Christianity. 4. As the same author shows further, John, Jesus and even Apollonius of Tyana were but epitomizers of the history of the Son under differences of aspect or condition. 74. The explanation, he says, is simple enough, when it is considered that the names Jesus, Hebrew, JSH, and Apollonius, or Apollo, are alike names of the Son in the heavens, and, necessarily, the history of the one. As to his travels through the signs, with the personifications of his sufferings, triumphs and miracles, could be but the history of the other, where there was a widespread, common method of describing those travels by personification. The fact that the secular church was founded by Constantine, and that it was a part of his decree that the venerable day of the sun should be the day set apart for the worship of Jesus Christ as Sunday, shows that they knew well in that secular church that the allegory rested upon an astronomical basis, as the author affirms. Yet, again, the circumstance that both Puranas and Bible are full of solar and astronomical allegories, does not militate against that other fact that all such scriptures in addition to these two are closed books to the scholars, having authority. Nor does it affect that other truth, that all those systems are not the work of mortal man, nor are they his invention in their origin and basis. Thus, Christos, under whatever name, means more than Charist, a mummy, or even the anointed, and the elect of theology. Both of the latter apply to Christos, the man of sorrow and tribulation, in his physical, mental, and psychic conditions, and both relate to the Hebrew Mashiach, from whence Messiah, condition, as the word is etymologized 75 by first. And the author of The Source of Measures, p. 255, Christos is the crown of glory of the suffering Christos of the mysteries, as of the candidate to the final union, of whatever race and creed. To the true follower of the Spirit of Truth, it matters little, therefore, whether Jesus, as man and Christos, lived during the era called Christian, or before, or never lived at all. The adepts, who lived and died for humanity, have existed in many and all the ages, and many were the good and holy men in antiquity who bore the surname or title of Christos before Jesus of Nazareth. Otherwise Jesus, or Jehoshua, ben Pandira was born. 76. Therefore, one may be permitted to conclude, with good reason, that Jesus, or Jehoshua, was like Socrates, like Phocion, like Theodorus, and so many others surnamed Christos, i.e. the good, the excellent, the gentle, and the holy initiate, who showed the way to the Christos condition, and thus became himself the way in the hearts of his enthusiastic admirers. The Christians, as all the hero worshippers, have tried to throw into the background all the other Christoi, who have appeared to them as rivals of their man-god. But if the voice of the mysteries has become silent for many ages in the West, if Eleusis, Memphis, Antium, Delphi, and Crisa have long ago been made the tombs of a science once as colossal in the West as it is yet in the East, there are successors now being prepared for them. We are in 1887 and the 19th century is close to its death. The 20th century has strange developments in store for humanity, and may even be the last of its name. Part 3. No one can be regarded as a Christian unless he professes, or is supposed to profess, belief in Jesus, by baptism, and in salvation, through the blood of Christ. To be considered a good Christian, one has, as a conditio sine qua non, to show faith in the dogmas expounded by the Church and to profess them. After which a man is at liberty to lead a private and public life on principles diametrically opposite to those expressed in the Sermon on the Mount. The chief point and that which is demanded of him is, that he should have, or pretend to have, a blind faith in, and veneration for, the ecclesiastical teachings of his special Church. Faith is the key of Christendom, saith Chaucer, and the penalty for lacking it is as clearly stated as words can make it, in St. Mark's Gospel, chapter 16, verse 16. He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved. But he that believeth not shall be damned. It troubles the Church very little that the most careful search for these words in the oldest texts during the last centuries remained fruitless. Or, that the recent revision of the Bible led to a unanimous conviction in the truth-seeking and truth-loving scholars employed in that task, that no such unchristlike sentence was to be found, except in some of the latest, fraudulent texts. The good Christian people had assimilated the consoling words, and they had become the very pith and marrow of their charitable souls. To take away the hope of eternal damnation, for all others except themselves, from these chosen vessels of the God of Israel, was like taking their very life. The truth-loving and God-fearing revisers got scared. They left the forged passage, an interpolation of 11 verses, from the 9th to the 20th, and satisfied their consciences with a footnote remark of a very equivocal character. One that would grace the work and do honor to the diplomatic faculties of the craftiest Jesuits. It tells the believer that the two oldest Greek misas and some other authorities omit from verse 9 to the end. Some authorities have a different ending to the Gospel, 77. And explains no further. But the two oldest Greek misas omit the verses nolens volens, as these have never existed. And the learned and truth-loving revisers know this better than any of us do. Yet the wicked falsehood is printed at the very seat of Protestant divinity, and it is allowed to go on, glaring into the faces of coming generations of students of theology and, hence, into those of their future parishioners. Neither can be, nor are they deceived by it, yet both pretend belief in the authenticity of the cruel words worthy of a theological Satan. And this Satan Moloch is their own God of infinite mercy and justice in heaven, and the incarnate symbol of love and charity on earth, blended in one. Truly mysterious are your paradoxical ways, O Churches of Christ. I have no intention of repeating here stale arguments and logical exposés of the whole theological scheme, for all this has been done, over and over again, and in a most excellent way, by the ablest infidels of England and America. But I may briefly repeat a prophecy which is a self-evident result of the present state of men's minds in Christendom. Belief in the Bible literally, and in a canalized Christ, will not last a quarter of a century longer. The churches will have to part with their cherished dogmas, or the 20th century will witness the downfall and ruin of all Christendom, and with it, belief even in a Christos, as pure spirit. The very name has now become obnoxious, and theological Christianity must die out, never to resurrect again in its present form. This, in itself, would be the happiest solution of all, were there no danger from the natural reaction which is sure to follow. Crass materialism will be the consequence and the result of centuries of blind faith. Unless the loss of old ideals is replaced by other ideals, unassailable, because universal, and built on the rock of eternal truths, instead of the shifting sands of human fancy. Pure immateriality must replace, in the end, the terrible anthropomorphism of those ideals in the conceptions of our modern dogmatists. Otherwise, why should Christian dogmas, the perfect counterpart of those belonging to other exoteric and pagan religions, claim any superiority? The bodies of all these were built upon the same astronomical and physiological, or phallic, symbols. Astrologically, every religious dogma the world over, may be traced to, and located in, the zodiacal signs and the sun. And so long as the science of comparative symbology or any theology has only two keys to open the mysteries of religious dogmas, and these two only very partially mastered, how can a line of demarcation be drawn? Or any difference made between the religions of, say, Krishna and Christ, between salvation through the blood of the firstborn primeval male of one faith, and that of the only begotten Son of the other, far younger, religion? Study the Vedas, read even the superficial, often disfigured writings of our great Orientalists, and think over what you will have learnt. Behold Brahmins, Egyptian hierophants, and Chaldean magi, teaching several thousand years before our era that the gods themselves had been only mortals, in previous births, until they won their immortality by offering their blood to their supreme god or chief. The Book of the Dead teaches that mortal man became one with the gods through an interflow of a common life in the common blood of the two. Mortals gave the blood of their firstborn sons in sacrifice to the gods. In his Hinduism, p. 35, Professor Munir Williams, translating from the Taittiriya Brahmana, writes, by means of the sacrifice the gods obtained heaven. And in the Tandya Brahmana, the Lord of creatures offered himself a sacrifice for the gods. And again in the Satapatha Brahmana, he who, knowing this, sacrifices with the Purushamedha or the sacrifice of the primeval male, becomes everything. Whenever I hear the Vedic rites discussed and called disgusting human sacrifices, and cannibalism, I feel always inclined to ask, where's the difference? Yet there is one, in fact. For while Christians are compelled to accept the allegorical, though, when understood, highly philosophical, drama of the New Testament crucifixion, as that of Abraham and Isaac literally 78. Brahmanism, its philosophical schools at any rate, teaches its adherents, that this, pagan, sacrifice of the primeval male is a purely allegorical and philosophical symbol. Read in their dead-letter meaning, the four Gospels are simply slightly altered versions of what the Church proclaims as satanic plagiarisms, by anticipation, of Christian dogmas in pagan religions. Materialism has a perfect right to find in all of them the same sensual worship and solar myths as anywhere else. Analyzed and criticized superficially and on its dead-letter face, Professor Joly, Man Before Metals, pp. 189-190, finding in the swastika, the crux ansata, and the cross pure and simple, mere sexual symbols, is justified in speaking as he does. Seeing that, the father of the sacred fire, in India, bore the name of Twashtri, that is the divine carpenter who made the swastika and the pramantha, whose friction produced the divine child Agni, in Latin Ignis, that his mother was named Maya. He himself, styled Acta, anointed, or Christos, after the priests had poured upon his head the spirituous soma and on his body butter purified by sacrifice. Seeing all this, he has a full right to remark that the close resemblance which exists between certain ceremonies of the worship of Agni and certain rites of the Catholic religion may be explained by their common origin. Agni in the condition of Acta, or anointed, is suggestive of Christ, Maya, Mary, his mother, Twashtri, Saint Joseph, the carpenter of the Bible. Has the professor of the science faculty of Toulouse explained anything by drawing attention to that which anyone can see? Of course not. But if, in his ignorance of the esoteric meaning of the allegory, he has added nothing to human knowledge, he has on the other hand destroyed faith in many of his pupils in both the divine origin, or Christianity, and its church, and helped to increase the number of materialists. For surely, no man, once he devotes himself to such comparative studies, can regard the religion of the West in any light but that of a pale and enfeebled copy of older and nobler philosophies. The origin of all religions, Judeo-Christianity included, is to be found in a few primeval truths, not one of which can be explained apart from all the others, as each is a complement of the rest in some one detail. And they are all, more or less, broken rays of the same Sun of Truth, and their beginnings have to be sought in the archaic records of the wisdom religion. Without the light of the latter, the greatest scholars can see but the skeletons thereof covered with masks of fancy, and based mostly on personified zodiacal signs. A thick film of allegory and blinds, the dark sayings, of fiction and parable, thus covers the original esoteric texts from which the New Testament, as now known, was compiled. Whence, then, the Gospels, the life of Jesus of Nazareth? Has it not been repeatedly stated that no human, mortal brain could have invented the life of the Jewish reformer, followed by the awful drama on Calvary? We say, on the authority of the esoteric Eastern school, that all this came from the Gnostics, as far as the name Christos and the astronomico-mystical allegories are concerned. And from the writings of the ancient Tannaim as regards the Kabbalistic connection of Jesus or Joshua, with the biblical personifications. One of these is the mystic esoteric name of Jehovah, not the present fanciful God of the profane Jews ignorant of their own mysteries, the God accepted by the still more ignorant Christians, but the compound Jehovah of the pagan initiation. This is proven very plainly by the glyphs or mystic combinations of various signs which have survived to this day in the Roman Catholic hieroglyphics. The Gnostic records contain the epitome of the chief scenes enacted during the mysteries of initiation, since the memory of man, though even that was given out invariably under the garb of semi-allegory, whenever entrusted to parchment or paper. But the ancient Tannaim, the initiates from whom the wisdom of the Kabbalah, oral tradition, was obtained by the later Talmudists, had in their possession the secrets of the mystery language, and it is in this language that the Gospels were written. 79 He alone who has mastered the esoteric cipher of antiquity, the secret meaning of the numerals, a common property at one time of all nations, has the full proof of the genius which was displayed in the blending of the purely Egypto-Jewish Old Testament allegories and names, and those of the pagan Greek Gnostics, the most refined of all the mystics of that day. Bishop Newton proves it himself quite innocently, by showing that Saint Barnabas, the companion of Saint Paul, in his epistle, ch. 9, discovers the name of Jesus crucified in the number 318, namely, Barnabas finds it in the mystic Greek iht, the tau being the glyph of the cross. On this, a Kabbalist, the author of an unpublished MS. On the key of formation of the mystery language, observes. But this is but a play upon the Hebrew letters Jod, Cheth, and Shin, from whence the IHS as the monogram of Christ coming down to our day, and this reads as JCHSH, or 381. And some of the letters being 318 or the number of Abraham and his Satan, and of Joshua and his Amalek. Also the number of Jacob and his antagonist. Godfrey Higgins gives the authority for the number 608. It is the number of Melchizedek's name, for the value of the last is 304 and Melchizedek was the priest of the Most High God, without beginning or ending of days. The solution and secret of Melchizedek are found in the fact that in the ancient pantheons the two planets which had existed from eternity, eonic eternity, and were eternal, were the sun and the moon, or Osiris and Isis. Hence the terms of without beginning or ending of days. 304 multiplied by 2 is 608. So also the numbers in the word Seth, who was a type of the year. There are a number of authorities for the number 888 as applying to the name of Jesus Christ, and as said this is in antagonism to the 666 of the Antichrist. The staple value in the name of Joshua was the number 365, the indication of the solar year, while Jehovah delighted in being the indication of the lunar year, and Jesus Christ was both Joshua and Jehovah in the Christian pantheon. This is but an illustration to our point to prove that the Christian application of the compound name Jesus Christ is all based on Gnostic and Eastern mysticism. It was only right and natural that chroniclers like the initiated Gnostics, pledged to secrecy, should veil or cloak the final meaning of their oldest and most sacred teachings. The right of the Church Fathers to cover the whole with an epitheme of euhemerized fancy is rather more dubious. 80 The Gnostic scribe and chronicler deceived no one. Every initiate into the archaic gnosis, whether of the pre-Christian or post-Christian period, knew well the value of every word of the mystery language. For these Gnostics, the inspirers of primitive Christianity, were the most cultured, the most learned and most wealthy of the Christian name, as Gibbon has it. Neither they, nor their humbler followers, were in danger of accepting the dead letter of their own texts. But it was different with the victims of the fabricators of what is now called Orthodox and historic Christianity. Their successors have all been made to fall into the mistakes of the foolish Galatians, reproved by Paul, who, as he tells them, Galat. 3, 1-5, having begun, by believing, in the Spirit, of Christos, ended by believing in the flesh, i.e., a corporeal Christ. For such is the true meaning of the Greek sentence 81, enarzomenoi pneumatai, non sarki epitolaist. That Paul was a Gnostic, a founder of a new sect of Gnosis which recognized, as all other Gnostic sects did, a Christ spirit, though it went against its opponents, the rival sects, is sufficiently clear to all but dogmatists and theologians. Nor is it less clear that the primitive teachings of Jesus, whenever he may have lived, could be discovered only in Gnostic teachings. Against which discovery, the falsifiers who drag down spirit into matter, thus degrading the noble philosophy of primeval wisdom religion, have taken ample precautions from the first. The works of Basilides alone, the philosopher devoted to the contemplation of divine things, as Clement describes him, the 24 volumes of his interpretations upon the Gospels, were all burned by order of the Church, Eusebius tells us, Hist. X. 4. 7. As these interpretations were written at a time when the Gospels we have now, were not yet in existence 82, here is a good proof that the Evangel, the doctrines of which were delivered to Basilides by the Apostle Matthew, and Glaucus, the disciple of Peter, Clemens Al. Strom. 7, section 106, must have differed widely from the present New Testament. Nor can these doctrines be judged by the distorted accounts of them left to posterity by Tertullian. Yet even the little this partisan fanatic gives, shows the chief Gnostic doctrines to be identical, under their own peculiar terminology and personations, with those of the secret doctrine of the East. For, discussing Basilides, the pious, godlike, theosophic philosopher, as Clement of Alexandria thought him, Tertullian exclaims. After this, Basilides, the heretic, broke loose. 83 He asserted that there is a supreme God, by name Abraxas, by whom mind, Mahat, was created which the Greeks call nous. From this emanated the word, from the word, providence, from providence, virtue and wisdom. From these two again, virtues, principalities 84, and powers were made, thence infinite productions and emissions of angels. Among the lowest angels, indeed, and those that made this world, he sets last of all the God of the Jews, whom he denies to be God himself, affirming that he is but one of the angels. 85, Isis Unveiled, 2:289. Another proof of the claim that the Gospel of Matthew in the usual Greek texts is not the original Gospel written in Hebrew, is given by no less an authority than Saint Jerome, or Hieronymus. The suspicion of a conscious and gradual euhemerization of the Christ principle ever since the beginning, grows into a conviction, once that one becomes acquainted with a certain confession contained in Book 2 of the Comment to Matthew by Hieronymus. For we find in it the proofs of a deliberate substitution of the whole Gospel, the one now in the canon having been evidently rewritten by this too zealous church father. 86 He says that he was sent toward the close of the 4th century by, their felicities, the bishops Chromatius and Heliodorus to Caesarea, with the mission to compare the Greek text, the only one they ever had, with the Hebrew original version preserved by the Nazarenes in their library, and to translate it. He translated it, but under protest, for, as he says, the Evangel exhibited matter not for edification, but for destruction. 87 That destruction, of what? Of the dogma that Jesus of Nazareth and the Christos are one, evidently. Hence for the destruction of the newly planned religion. 88 In this same letter the saint, who advised his converts to kill their fathers, trample on the bosom that fed them, by walking over the bodies of their mothers. If the parents stood as an obstacle between their sons and Christ, admits that Matthew did not wish his gospel to be openly written, hence that the MS was a secret one. But while admitting also that this gospel was written in Hebrew characters and by the hand of himself, Matthew, yet in another place he contradicts himself and assures posterity that as it was tampered with and rewritten by a disciple of Manichaeus, named Seleucus, the ears of the church properly refused to listen to it. Hieronymus, Comment. To Matthew, Book 2. Chapter 12, 13. No wonder that the very meaning of the terms Christos and Christos, and the bearing of both on Jesus of Nazareth, a name coined out of Joshua the Nazar, has now become a dead letter for all with the exception of non-Christian occultists. For even the Kabbalists have no original data now to rely upon. The Zohar and the Kabbalah have been remodeled by Christian hands out of recognition. And were it not for a copy of the Chaldean Book of Numbers, there would remain no better than garbled accounts. Let not our brothers, the so-called Christian Kabbalists of England and France, many of whom are Theosophists, protest too vehemently. For this is history, see Monk. It is as foolish to maintain, as some German Orientalists and modern critics still do, that the Kabbalah has never existed before the day of the Spanish Jew, Moses de Leon, accused of having forged this pseudograph in the 13th century. As to claim that any of the Kabbalistical works now in our possession are as original as they were when Rabbi Simeon ben Jokai delivered the traditions to his sons and followers. Not a single of these books is immaculate, none has escaped mutilation by Christian hands. Monk, one of the most learned and able critics of his day on this subject, proves it, while protesting as we do, against the assumption that it is a post-Christian forgery. For he says, "It appears evident to us that the author made use of ancient documents, and among these of certain midraskim or collections of traditions and biblical expositions, which we do not now possess." After which, quoting from Dholuk, 1, c. pp. 24 and 31, he adds, Haya Jain, who died in 1038, is to our knowledge the first author who developed the theory of the Sephiroth, and he gave to them the names which we find again to be among the Kabbalists, Telenik, Moses ben Skem Tab de Leon, p. 13, note 5, this doctor, who had intimate intercourse with the Syrian and Chaldean Christian savans, was enabled by these last to acquire a knowledge of some of the Gnostic writings. Which Gnostic writings and esoteric tenets passed part and parcel into the Kabbalistic works, with many more modern interpolations that we now find in the Zohar, as Monk well proves. The Kabbalah is Christian now, not Jewish. Thus, what with several generations of most active church fathers ever working at the destruction of old documents and the preparation of new passages to be interpolated in those which happen to survive, there remains of the Gnostics, the legitimate offspring of the archaic wisdom religion, but a few unrecognizable shreds. But a particle of genuine gold will glitter forever. And, however garbled the accounts left by Tertullian and Epiphanius of the doctrines of the heretics, an occultist can yet find even in them traces of those primeval truths which were once universally imparted during the mysteries of initiation. Among other works with most suggestive allegories in them, we have still the so-called apocryphal Gospels, and the last discovered as the most precious relic of Gnostic literature, a fragment called Pistis Sophia, Knowledge Wisdom. In my next article upon the esoteric character of the Gospels, I hope to be able to demonstrate that those who translate pistis by faith are utterly wrong. The word faith, as grace or something to be believed in through unreasoned or blind faith, is a word that dates only since Christianity. Nor has Paul ever used this term in this sense in his epistles, and Paul was undeniably an initiate. This series was never completed by H.P.B. Astral bodies, or doppelgangers. M.C. Great confusion exists in the minds of people about the various kinds of apparitions, wraiths, ghosts, or spirits. Ought we not to explain once for all the meaning of these terms? You say there are various kinds of doubles, what are they? H.P.B. Our occult philosophy teaches us that there are three kinds of doubles, to use the word in its widest sense. First, man has his double or shadow, properly so called, around which the physical body of the fetus, the future man, is built. The imagination of the mother, or an accident which affects the child, will affect also the astral body. The astral and the physical both exist before the mind is developed into action, and before the Atma awakes. This occurs when the child is 7 years old, and with it comes the responsibility attaching to a conscious sentient being. This double is born with man, dies with him, and can never separate itself far from the body during life, and those surviving him, it disintegrates, pari passu, with the corpse. It is this which is sometimes seen over the graves like a luminous figure of the man that was, during certain atmospheric conditions. From its physical aspect it is, during life, man's vital double, and after death, only the gases given off from the decaying body. But, as regards its origin and essence, it is something more. This double is what we have agreed to call linga sarira, but which I would propose to call, for greater convenience, protean or plastic body. M.C. Why protean or plastic? H.P.B. Protean, because it can assume all forms, e.g. the shepherd magicians, whom popular rumor accuses, perhaps not without some reason, of being werewolves, and mediums in cabinets, whose own plastic bodies play the part of materialized grandmothers and John Kings. Otherwise, why the invariable custom of the dear departed angels to come out but little further than arm's length from the medium, whether entranced or not? Mind, I do not at all deny foreign influences in this kind of phenomena. But I do affirm that foreign interference is rare, and that the materialized form is always that of the medium's astral, or protean body. M.C. How is this astral body created? H.P.B. It is not created. It grows, as I told you, with the man and exists in the rudimentary condition even before the child is born. M.C. And what about the second? H.P.B. The second is the thought body, or dream body, rather. Known among occultists as the Mayavi Rupa, or illusion body. During life this image is the vehicle both of thought and of the animal passions and desires, drawing at one and the same time from the lowest terrestrial manas, mind, and kama, the element of desire. It is dual in its potentiality, and after death forms what is called in the East or kamarupa, but which is better known to theosophists as the spook. M.C. And the third? H.P.B. The third is the true ego, called in the East by a name meaning causal body, but which in the trans-Himalayan schools is always called the karmic body, which is the same. For karma, or action, is the cause which produces incessant rebirths or reincarnations. It is not the monad, nor is it manas proper, but is, in a way, indissolubly connected with and a compound of the monad and manas in devotion. M.C. Then there are three doubles. H.P.B. If you call the Christian and other trinities three gods, then there are three doubles. But in truth there is only one under three aspects or phases, the most material portion disappearing with the body. The middle one surviving both as an independent but temporary entity in the land of shadows, the third, immortal throughout the Manvantara, unless nirvana puts an end to it before. M.C. But shall not we be asked what difference there is between the Mayavi and Kamarupa, or as you propose to call them the dream body, and the spook? H.P.B. Most likely, and we shall answer, in addition to what has been said, that the thought power, or aspect of the Mayavi or illusion body, merges after death entirely into the causal body or the conscious, thinking ego. The animal elements, or power of desire of the dream body, absorbing after death that which it has collected, through its insatiable desire to live, during life, i.e. all the astral vitality as well as all the impressions of its material acts and thoughts while it lived in possession of the body, forms the spook or kamarupa. Our theosophists know well enough that after death the higher manas unites with the monad and passes into devotion, while the dregs of the lower manas or animal mind go to form this spook. This has life in it, but hardly any consciousness, except, as it were, by proxy, when it is drawn into the current of a medium. M.C. Is it all that can be said upon the subject? H.P.B. For the present this is enough metaphysics, I guess. Let us hold to the double in its earthly phase. What would you know? M.C. Every country in the world believes more or less in the double or doppelganger. The simplest form of this is the appearance of a man's phantom the moment after his death, or at the instant of death, to his dearest friend. Is this appearance the Mayavi Rupa? H.P.B. It is, because produced by the thought of the dying man. M. C. Is it unconscious? H.P.B. It is unconscious to the extent that the dying man does not generally do it knowingly, nor is he aware that he so appears. What happens is this. If he thinks very intently at the moment of death of the person he either is very anxious to see, or loves best, he may appear to that person. The thought becomes objective. The double, or shadow of a man, being nothing but the faithful reproduction of him, like a reflection in a mirror, that which the man does, even in thought, that the double repeats. This is why the phantoms are often seen in such cases in the clothes they wear at the particular moment, and the image reproduces even the expression on the dying man's face. If the double of a man bathing were seen, it would seem to be immersed in water, so when a man who has been drowned appears to his friend, the image will be seen to be dripping with water. The cause for the apparition may also be reversed, i.e., the dying man may or may not be thinking at all of the particular person his image appears to, but it is that person who is sensitive. Or perhaps his sympathy or his hatred for the individual whose wraith is thus evoked is very intense physically or psychically, and in this case the apparition is created by, and depends upon the intensity of the thought. What then happens is this. Let us call the dying man A, and him who sees the double B. The latter, owing to love, hate, or fear, has the image of a so deeply impressed on his psychic memory, that actual magnetic attraction and repulsion are established between the two, whether one knows of it and feels it, or not. When it dies, the sixth sense or psychic spiritual intelligence of the inner man in B becomes cognizant of the change in A, and forthwith apprises the physical senses of the man by projecting before his eye the form of A as it is at the instant of the great change. The same when the dying man longs to see someone, his thought telegraphs to his friend, consciously or unconsciously along the wire of sympathy, and becomes objective. This is what the Spookical Research Society would pompously, but none the less muddily, call telepathic impact. M.C. This applies to the simplest form of the appearance of the double. What about cases in which the double does that which is contrary to the feeling and wish of the man? H.P.B. This is impossible. The double cannot act unless the keynote of this action was struck in the brain of the man to whom the double belongs, be that man just dead, or alive, in good or in bad health. If he paused on the thought a second, long enough to give it form, before he passed on to other mental pictures, this 1 second is as sufficient for the objectivization of his personality on the astral waves. As for your face to impress itself on the sensitized plate of a photographic apparatus, nothing prevents your form then being seized upon by the surrounding forces, as a dry leaf fallen from a tree is taken up and carried away by the wind, being made to caricature or distort your thought. M.C. Supposing the double expresses in actual words a thought uncongenial to the man, and expresses it, let us say to a friend far away, perhaps on another continent. I have known instances of this occurring. H.P.B. Because it then so happens that the created image is taken up and used by a shell. Just as in séance rooms when images of the dead, which may perhaps be lingering unconsciously in the memory or even the auras of those present, are seized upon by the elementals or elementary shadows and made objective to the audience, and even caused to act at the bidding of the strongest of the many different wills in the room. In your case, moreover, there must exist a connecting link, a telegraph wire, between the two persons, a point of psychic sympathy, and on this the thought travels instantly. Of course there must be, in every case, some strong reason why that particular thought takes that direction, it must be connected in some way with the other person. Otherwise such apparitions would be of common and daily occurrence. M.C. This seems very simple, why then does it only occur with exceptional persons? H.P.B. Because the plastic power of the imagination is much stronger in some persons than in others. The mind is dual in its potentiality, it is physical and metaphysical. The higher part of the mind is connected with the spiritual soul or buddhi, the lower with the animal soul, the kama principle. There are persons who never think with the higher faculties of their minds at all. Those who do so are the minority and are thus, in a way, beyond, if not above, the average of humankind. These will think even upon ordinary matters on that higher plane. The idiosyncrasy of the person determines in which principle of the mind the thinking is done, as also the faculties of a preceding life, and sometimes the heredity of the physical. This is why it is so very difficult for a materialist, the metaphysical portion of whose brain is almost atrophied, to raise himself, or for one who is naturally spiritually minded to descend to the level of the matter-of-fact vulgar thought. Optimism and pessimism depend on it also in a great measure. M.C. But the habit of thinking in the higher mind can be developed, else there would be no hope for persons who wish to alter their lives and raise themselves. And that this is possible must be true, or there would be no hope for the world. H.P.B. Certainly it can be developed, but only with great difficulty, a firm determination, and through much self-sacrifice. But it is comparatively easy for those who are born with the gift. Why is it that one person sees poetry in a cabbage or a pig with her little ones, while another will perceive in the loftiest things only their lowest and most material aspect, will laugh at the music of the spheres, and ridicule the most sublime conceptions and philosophies? This difference depends simply on the innate power of the mind to think on the higher or on the lower plane, with the astral, in the sense given to the word by St. Martin, or with the physical brain. Great intellectual powers are often no proof of, but are impediments to spiritual and right conceptions, witness most of the great men of science. We must rather pity than blame them. M.C. But how is it that the person who thinks on the higher plane produces more perfect and more potential images and objective forms by his thought? H.P.B. Not necessarily that person alone, but all those who are generally sensitives. The person who is endowed with this faculty of thinking about even the most trifling things from the higher plane of thought has, by virtue of that gift which he possesses, a plastic power of formation, so to say, in his very imagination. Whatever such a person may think about, his thought will be so far more intense than the thought of an ordinary person, that by this very intensity it obtains the power of creation. Science has established the fact that thought is an energy. This energy in its action disturbs the atoms of the astral atmosphere around us. I already told you, the rays of thought have the same potentiality for producing forms in the astral atmosphere as the sunrays have with regard to a lens. Every thought so evolved with energy from the brain, creates, nolens volens, a shape. M.C. Is that shape absolutely unconscious? H.P.B. Perfectly unconscious unless it is the creation of an adept, who has a preconceived object in giving it consciousness, or rather in sending along with it enough of his will and intelligence to cause it to appear conscious. This ought to make us more cautious about our thoughts. But the wide distinction that obtains between the adept in this matter and the ordinary man must be borne in mind. The adept may at his will use his Mayavirupa, but the ordinary man does not, except in very rare cases. It is called Mayavirupa because it is a form of illusion created for use in the particular instance, and it has quite enough of the adept's mind in it to accomplish its purpose. The ordinary man merely creates a thought image, whose properties and powers are at the time wholly unknown to him. M.C. Then one may say that the form of an adept appearing at a distance from his body, as for instance Ram Lal in Mr. Isaacs, is simply an image. H.P.B. Exactly. It is a walking thought. M.C. In which case an adept can appear in several places almost simultaneously. H.P.B. He can. Just as Apollonius of Tyana, who was seen in two places at once, while his body was at Rome. But it must be understood that not all of even the astral adept is present in each appearance. M.C. Then it is very necessary for a person of any amount of imagination and psychic powers to attend to their thoughts. H.P.B. Certainly, for each thought has a shape which borrows the appearance of the man engaged in the action of which he thought. Otherwise how can clairvoyants see in your aura your past and present? What they see is a passing panorama of yourself represented in successive actions by your thoughts. You asked me if we are punished for our thoughts. Not for all, for some are stillborn, but for the others, those which we call silent, but potential thoughts, yes. Take an extreme case, such as that of a person who is so wicked as to wish the death of another. Unless the evil wisher is a dugpa, a high adept in black magic, in which case karma is delayed, such a wish only comes back to roost. M.C. But supposing the evil wisher to have a very strong will, without being a dugpa, could the death of the other be accomplished? H.P.B. Only if the malicious person has the evil eye, which simply means possessing enormous plastic power of imagination working involuntarily, and thus turned unconsciously to bad uses. For what is the power of the evil eye? Simply a great plastic power of thought, so great as to produce a current impregnated with the potentiality of every kind of misfortune and accident, which inoculates, or attaches itself to any person who comes within it. A jetator, one with the evil eye, need not be even imaginative, or have evil intentions or wishes. He may be simply a person who is naturally fond of witnessing or reading about sensational scenes, such as murder, executions, accidents, etc., etc. He may be not even thinking of any of these at the moment his eye meets his future victim. But the currents have been produced and exist in his visual ray ready to spring into activity the instant they find suitable soil, like a seed fallen by the way and ready to sprout at the first opportunity. M.C. But how about the thoughts you call silent? Do such wishes or thoughts come home to roost? H.P.B. They do, just as a ball which fails to penetrate an object rebounds upon the thrower. This happens even to some dugpa or sorcerers who are not strong enough, or do not comply with the rules, for even they have rules they have to abide by, but not with those who are regular, fully developed, black magicians. For such have the power to accomplish what they wish. M.C. When you speak of rules it makes me want to wind up this talk by asking you what everybody wants to know who takes any interest in occultism. What is a principle or important suggestion for those who have these powers and wish to control them rightly, in fact to enter occultism? H.P.B. The first and most important step in occultism is to learn how to adapt your thoughts and ideas to your plastic potency. M.C. Why is this so important? H.P.B. Because otherwise you are creating things by which you may be making bad karma. No one should go into occultism or even touch it before he is perfectly acquainted with his own powers, and that he knows how to commensurate it with his actions. And this he can do only by deeply studying the philosophy of occultism before entering upon the practical training. Otherwise, as sure as fate, he will fall into black magic. Constitution of the inner man. Of course it is most difficult, and, as you say, puzzling, to understand correctly and distinguish between the various aspects, called by us the principles, of the real ego. It is the more so as there exists a notable difference in the numbering of those principles by various Eastern schools, though at the bottom there is the same identical substratum of teaching in all of them. X. Are you thinking of the Vedantins? They divide our 7 principles into 5 only, I believe. M. They do, but though I would not presume to dispute the point with a learned Vedantin, I may yet state as my private opinion that they have an obvious reason for it. With them it is only that compound spiritual aggregate which consists of various mental aspects that is called man at all, the physical body being in their view something beneath contempt, and merely an illusion. Nor is the Vedanta the only philosophy to reckon in this manner. Lao Tzu in his Tao Te Ching mentions only 5 principles, because he, like the Vedantins, omits to include 2 principles, namely, the spirit, Atma, and the physical body, the latter of which, moreover, he calls the cadaver. Then there is the Tarka Raja Yoga school. Its teaching recognizes only 3 principles, in fact. But then, in reality, their Stulapadi, or the physical body in its Jagrata or waking conscious state, their sukshmapadki, the same body in svapna or the dreaming state, and their karanapati or causal body. Or that which passes from one incarnation to another, are all dual in their aspects, and thus make 6. Add to this Atma, the impersonal divine principle or the immortal element in man, undistinguished from the universal spirit, and you have the same 7, again, as in the esoteric division. 89. X. Then it seems almost the same as the division made by mystic Christians, body, soul, and spirit. M. Just the same. We could easily make of the body the vehicle of the vital double, of the latter the vehicle of life or prana. Of Kamarupa, or animal, soul, the vehicle of the higher and the lower mind, and make of this 6 principles, crowning the whole with the one immortal spirit. In occultism, every qualificative change in the state of our consciousness gives to man a new aspect, and if it prevails and becomes part of the living and acting ego, it must be, and is, given a special name. To distinguish the man in that particular state from the man he is when he places himself in another state. X. It is just that which is so difficult to understand. M. It seems to me very easy, on the contrary, once that you have seized the main idea, i.e. that man acts on this, or another plane of consciousness, in strict accordance with his mental and spiritual condition. But such is the materialism of the age that the more we explain, the less people seem capable of understanding what we say. Divide the terrestrial being called man into 3 chief aspects, if you like, but, unless you make of him a pure animal, you cannot do less. Take his objective body. The feeling principle in him, which is only a little higher than the instinctual element in the animal, or the vital elementary soul, and that which places him so immeasurably beyond and higher than the animal, i.e. his reasoning soul or spirit. Well, if we take these 3 groups or representative entities, and subdivide them, according to the occult teaching, what do we get? First of all spirit, in the sense of the absolute, and therefore invisible all, or Atma. As this can neither be located nor conditioned in philosophy, being simply that which is, in eternity, and as the all cannot be absent from even the tiniest geometrical or mathematical point of the universe of matter or substance. It ought not to be called, in truth, a human principle at all. Rather, and at best, it is that point in metaphysical space which the human monad and its vehicle man occupy for the period of every life. Now that point is as imaginary as man himself, and in reality is an illusion, a maya. But then for ourselves as for other personal egos, we are a reality during that fit of illusion called life, and we have to take ourselves into account, in our own fancy at any rate, if no one else does. To make it more conceivable to the human intellect, when first attempting the study of occultism, and to solve the ABC of the mystery of man, occultism calls it the 7th principle, the synthesis of the 6. And gives it for vehicle the spiritual soul, buddhi. Now the latter conceals a mystery, which is never given to any one with the exception of irrevocably pledged chelists, those at any rate, who can be safely trusted. Of course there would be less confusion, could it only be told. But, as this is directly concerned with the power of projecting one's double consciously and at will, and as this gift like the ring of Gyges, might prove very fatal to men at large and to the possessor of that faculty in particular, it is carefully guarded. Alone the adepts, who have been tried and can never be found wanting, have the key of the mystery fully divulged to them. Let us avoid side issues, however, and hold to the principles. This divine soul or buddhi, then, is the vehicle of the spirit. In conjunction, these two are one, impersonal, and without any attributes, on this plane, of course, and make 2 spiritual principles. If we pass on to the human soul, manas, the mens, every one will agree that the intelligence of man is dual to say the least, e.g., the high-minded man can hardly become low-minded. The very intellectual and spiritual-minded man is separated by an abyss from the obtuse, dull and material, if not animal-minded man. Why then should not these men be represented by 2 principles, or 2 aspects rather? Every man has these 2 principles in him, one more active than the other, and in rare cases, one of these is entirely stunted in its growth, so to say paralyzed by the strength and predominance of the other aspect, during the life of man. These, then, are what we call the two principles or aspects of manas, the higher and the lower, the former, the higher manas, or the thinking, conscious ego gravitating toward the spiritual soul, buddhi. And the latter, or its instinctual principle attracted to kama, the seat of animal desires and passions in man. Thus, we have four principles justified, the last three being, 1, the double, which we have agreed to call protean, or plastic soul. The vehicle of, 2, the life principle, and, 3, the physical body. Of course no physiologist or biologist will accept these principles, nor can he make head or tail of them. And this is why, perhaps, none of them understand to this day either the functions of the spleen, the physical vehicle of the protean double, or those of a certain organ on the right side of man, the seat of the above-mentioned desires. Nor yet does he know anything of the pineal gland, which he describes as a horny gland with a little sand in it, and which is the very key to the highest and divinest consciousness in man, his omniscient, spiritual and all-embracing mind. This seemingly useless appendage is the pendulum which, once the clockwork of the inner man is wound up, carries the spiritual vision of the ego to the highest planes of perception, where the horizon opened before it becomes almost infinite. But the scientific materialists assert that after the death of man nothing remains. That the human body simply disintegrates into its component elements, and that what we call soul is merely a temporary self-consciousness produced as a byproduct of organic action, which will evaporate like steam. Is not theirs a strange state of mind? Not strange at all, that I see. If they say that self-consciousness ceases with the body, then in their case they simply utter an unconscious prophecy. For once that they are firmly convinced of what they assert, no conscious afterlife is possible for them. But if human self-consciousness survives death as a rule, why should there be exceptions? In the fundamental laws of the spiritual world which are immutable, no exception is possible. But there are rules for those who see, and rules for those who prefer to remain blind. Quite so, I understand. It is an aberration of a blind man, who denies the existence of the sun because he does not see it. But after death his spiritual eyes will certainly compel him to see. They will not compel him, nor will he see anything. Having persistently denied an afterlife during this life, he will be unable to sense it. His spiritual senses having been stunted, they cannot develop after death, and he will remain blind. By insisting that he must see it, you evidently mean one thing and I another. You speak of the spirit from the spirit, or the flame from the flame, of Atma in short, and you confuse it with the human soul, manas. You do not understand me, let me try to make it clear. The whole gist of your question is to know whether, in the case of a downright materialist, the complete loss of self-consciousness and self-perception after death is possible. Isn't it so? I say, it is possible. Because, believing firmly in our esoteric doctrine, which refers to the post-mortem period, or the interval between two lives or births as merely a transitory state. I say, whether that interval between two acts of the illusionary drama of life lasts 1 year or 1,000,000, that post-mortem state may, without any breach of the fundamental law, prove to be just the same state as that of a man who is in a dead swoon. But since you have just said that the fundamental laws of the after-death state admit of no exceptions, how can this be? Nor do I say now that they admit of exceptions. But the spiritual law of continuity applies only to things which are truly real. To one who has read and understood Mandukya Upanishad and Vedantasara, all this becomes very clear. I will say more. It is sufficient to understand what we mean by buddhi and the duality of manas to have a very clear perception why the materialist may not have a self-conscious survival after death, because manas, in its lower aspect, is the seat of the terrestrial mind, and, therefore, can give only that perception of the universe which is based on the evidence of that mind, and not on our spiritual vision. It is said in our esoteric school that between buddhi and manas, or isvara and prajna 90, there is in reality no more difference than between a forest and its trees, a lake and its waters, just as Mandukya teaches. One or hundreds of trees dead from loss of vitality, or uprooted, are yet incapable of preventing the forest from being still a forest. The destruction or post-mortem death of one personality dropped out of the long series, will not cause the smallest change in the spiritual ego, and it will ever remain the same ego. Only, instead of experiencing devotion it will have to immediately reincarnate. But as I understand it, ego buddhi represents in this simile the forest and the personal minds the trees. And if buddhi is immortal, how can that which is similar to it, i.e., Manastijasi 91, lose entirely its consciousness till the day of its new incarnation? I cannot understand it. You cannot, because you will mix up an abstract representation of the whole with its casual changes of form, and because you confuse Manastijasi, the buddhi-lit human soul, with the latter, animalized. Remember that if it can be said of buddhi that it is unconditionally immortal, the same cannot be said of Manas, still less of Taijasi, which is an attribute. No post-mortem consciousness or Manastijasi can exist apart from buddhi, the divine soul, because the first, Manas, is, in its lower aspect, a qualificative attribute of the terrestrial personality. And the second, Taijasi, is identical with the first, and that it is the same Manas only with the light of buddhi reflected on it. In its turn, buddhi would remain only an impersonal spirit without this element which it borrows from the human soul, which conditions and makes of it, in this elusive universe. As it were something separate from the universal soul for the whole period of the cycle of incarnation. Say rather that buddhi manas can neither die nor lose its compound self-consciousness in eternity, nor the recollection of its previous incarnations in which the two, i.e., the spiritual and the human soul, had been closely linked together. But it is not so in the case of a materialist, whose human soul not only receives nothing from the divine soul, but even refuses to recognize its existence. You can hardly apply this axiom to the attributes and qualifications of the human soul. For it would be like saying that because your divine soul is immortal, therefore the bloom on your cheek must also be immortal, whereas this bloom, like Taijasi, or spiritual radiance, is simply a transitory phenomenon. Do I understand you to say that we must not mix in our minds the noumenon with the phenomenon, the cause with its effect? I do say so, and repeat that, limited to Manas or the human soul alone, the radiance of Taijasi itself becomes a mere question of time. Because both immortality and consciousness after death become for the terrestrial personality of man simply conditioned attributes, as they depend entirely on conditions and beliefs created by the human soul itself during the life of its body. Karma acts incessantly, we reap in our afterlife only the fruit of that which we have ourselves sown, or rather created in our terrestrial existence. But if my ego can, after the destruction of my body, become plunged in a state of entire unconsciousness, then where can be the punishment for the sins of my past life? Our philosophy teaches that karmic punishment reaches the ego only in its next incarnation. After death it receives only the reward for the unmerited sufferings endured during its just past existence. 92 The whole punishment after death, even for the materialist, consists therefore in the absence of any reward and the utter loss of the consciousness of one's bliss and rest. Karma is the child of the terrestrial ego, the fruit of the actions of the tree which is the objective personality visible to all, as much as the fruit of all the thoughts and even motives of the spiritual I. But karma is also the tender mother, who heals the wounds inflicted by her during the preceding life, before she will begin to torture this ego by inflicting upon him new ones. If it may be said that there is not a mental or physical suffering in the life of a mortal, which is not the fruit and consequence of some sin in this, or a preceding existence on the other hand. Since he does not preserve the slightest recollection of it in his actual life and feels himself not deserving of such punishment, but believes sincerely he suffers for no guilt of his own. This alone is quite sufficient to entitle the human soul to the fullest consolation, rest and bliss in his post-mortem existence. Death comes to our spiritual selves ever as a deliverer and friend. For the materialist, who, notwithstanding his materialism, was not a bad man. The interval between the two lives will be like the unbroken and placid sleep of a child. Either entirely dreamless, or with pictures of which he will have no definite perception. For the believer it will be a dream as vivid as life and full of realistic bliss and visions. As for the bad and cruel man, whether materialist or otherwise, he will be immediately reborn and suffer his hell on earth. To enter Avicii is an exceptional and rare occurrence. X. As far as I remember, the periodical incarnations of Sutratma 93 are likened in some Upanishad to the life of a mortal which oscillates periodically between sleep and waking. This does not seem to me very clear, and I will tell you why. For the man who awakes, another day commences, but that man is the same in soul and body as he was the day before. Whereas at every new incarnation a full change takes place not only in his external envelope, sex and personality, but even in his mental and psychic capacities. Thus the simile does not seem to me quite correct. The man who arises from sleep remembers quite clearly what he has done yesterday, the day before, and even months and years ago. But none of us has the slightest recollection of a preceding life or any fact or event concerning it. I may forget in the morning what I have dreamed during the night, still I know that I have slept and have the certainty that I lived during sleep, but what recollection have I of my past incarnation? How do you reconcile this? M. Yet some people do recollect their past incarnations. This is what the Arhats call Samasambhuddha, or the knowledge of the whole series of one's past incarnations. X. But we ordinary mortals who have not reached Samasambhuddha, how can we be expected to realize this simile? M. By studying it and trying to understand more correctly the characteristics of the three states of sleep. Sleep is a general and immutable law for man as for beast, but there are different kinds of sleep and still more different dreams and visions. X. Just so. But this takes us from our subject. Let us return to the materialist, who, while not denying dreams, which he could hardly do, yet denies immortality in general and the survival of his own individuality especially. M. And the materialist is right for once, at least. Since for one who has no inner perception and faith, there is no immortality possible. In order to live in the world to come a conscious life, one has to believe first of all in that life during one's terrestrial existence. On these two aphorisms of the secret science all the philosophy about the post-mortem consciousness and the immortality of the soul is built. The ego receives always according to its deserts. After the dissolution of the body, there commences for it either a period of full clear consciousness, a state of chaotic dreams, or an utterly dreamless sleep indistinguishable from annihilation, and these are the three states of consciousness. Our physiologists find the cause of dreams and visions in an unconscious preparation for them during the waking hours. Why cannot the same be admitted for the post-mortem dreams? I repeat it, death is sleep. After death begins, before the spiritual eyes of the soul, a performance according to a program learned and very often composed unconsciously by ourselves. The practical carrying out of correct beliefs or of illusions which have been created by ourselves. A Methodist will be a Methodist, a Mussulman of course, just for a time, in a perfect fool's paradise of each man's creation and making. These are the post-mortem fruits of the tree of life. Naturally, our belief or unbelief in the fact of conscious immortality is unable to influence the unconditioned reality of the fact itself, once that it exists. But the belief or unbelief in that immortality, as the continuation or annihilation of separate entities cannot fail to give color to that fact in its application to each of these entities. Now do you begin to understand it? X. I think I do. The materialist, disbelieving in everything that cannot be proven to him by his five senses or by scientific reasoning, and rejecting every spiritual manifestation, accepts life as the only conscious existence. Therefore, according to their beliefs so will it be unto them. They will lose their personal ego, and will plunge into a dreamless sleep until a new awakening. Is it so? M. Almost so. Remember the universal esoteric teaching of the two kinds of conscious existence, the terrestrial and the spiritual. The latter must be considered real from the very fact that it is the region of the eternal, changeless, immortal cause of all. Whereas the incarnating ego dresses itself up in new garments entirely different from those of its previous incarnations, and in which all except its spiritual prototype is doomed to a change so radical as to leave no trace behind. Stop. Can the consciousness of my terrestrial egos perish not only for a time, like the consciousness of the materialist, but in any case so entirely as to leave no trace behind? According to the teaching, it must so perish and in its fullness, all except that principle which, having united itself with the monad, has thereby become a purely spiritual and indestructible essence, one with it in the eternity. But in the case of an out-and-out materialist, in whose personal no buddhi has ever reflected itself, how can the latter carry away into the infinitudes one particle of that terrestrial personality? Your spiritual is immortal. But from your present self it can carry away into afterlife but that which has become worthy of immortality, namely, the aroma alone of the flower that has been mown by death. Well, and the flower, the terrestrial The flower, as all past and future flowers which blossomed and died, and will blossom again on the mother bough, the Sutratma, all children of one root or buddhi, will return to dust. Your present as you yourself know, is not the body now sitting before me, nor yet is it what I would call Manasutratma, but Sutratma Buddhi. But this does not explain to me at all, why you call life after death immortal, infinite, and real, and the terrestrial life a simple phantom or illusion. Since even that post-mortem life has limits, however much wider they may be than those of terrestrial life. No doubt. The spiritual ego of man moves in eternity like a pendulum between the hours of life and death. But if these hours marking the periods of terrestrial and spiritual life are limited in their duration, and if the very number of such stages in eternity between sleep and awakening, illusion and reality, has its beginning and its end. On the other hand, the spiritual pilgrim is eternal. Therefore are the hours of his post-mortem life, when disembodied he stands face to face with truth and not the mirages of his transitory earthly existences during the period of that pilgrimage which we call the cycle of rebirths, the only reality in our conception. Such intervals, their limitation notwithstanding, do not prevent the ego, while ever perfecting itself, to be following undeviatingly, though gradually and slowly, the path to its last transformation. When that ego having reached its goal becomes the divine all. These intervals and stages help towards this final result instead of hindering it, and without such limited intervals the divine ego could never reach its ultimate goal. This ego is the actor and its numerous and various incarnations the parts it plays. Shall you call these parts with their costumes the individuality of the actor himself? Like that actor, the ego is forced to play during the cycle of necessity up to the very threshold of parinirvana many parts such as may be unpleasant to it. But as the bee collects its honey from every flower, leaving the rest as food for the earthly worms, so does our spiritual individuality, whether we call it Sutratma or ego. It collects from every terrestrial personality into which karma forces it to incarnate, the nectar alone of the spiritual qualities and self-consciousness. And uniting all these into one whole it emerges from its chrysalis as the glorified Dhyani Chohan. So much the worse for those terrestrial personalities from which it could collect nothing. Such personalities cannot assuredly outlive consciously their terrestrial existence. Thus then it seems, that for the terrestrial personality, immortality is still conditional. Is then immortality itself not unconditional? Not at all. But it cannot touch the non-existent. For all that which exists as Sat, ever-aspiring Sat, immortality and eternity are absolute. Matter is the opposite pole of spirit and yet the two are one. The essence of all this, i.e. spirit, force and matter, or the three in one, is as endless as it is beginningless, but the form acquired by the triple unity during incarnations, the externality, is certainly only the illusion of our personal conceptions. Therefore do we call the afterlife alone a reality, while relegating the terrestrial life, its terrestrial personality included, to the phantom realm of illusion. But why in such a case not call sleep the reality, and waking the illusion, instead of the reverse. M. Because we use an expression made to facilitate the grasping of the subject, and from the standpoint of terrestrial conceptions, it is a very correct one. X. Nevertheless, I cannot understand. If the life to come is based on justice and the merited retribution for all our terrestrial suffering, how, in the case of materialists many of whom are ideally honest and charitable men, should there remain of their personality nothing but the refuse of a faded flower? M. No one ever said such a thing. No materialist, if a good man, however unbelieving, can die forever in the fullness of his spiritual individuality. What was said is, that the consciousness of one life can disappear either fully or partially. In the case of a thorough materialist, no vestige of that personality which disbelieved remains in the series of lives. X. But is this not annihilation to the ego? M. Certainly not. One can sleep a dead sleep during a long railway journey, miss one or several stations without the slightest recollection or consciousness of it, awake at another station and continue the journey recollecting other halting places, till the end of that journey, when the goal is reached. 3 kinds of sleep were mentioned to you, the dreamless, the chaotic, and the one so real, that to the sleeping man his dreams become full realities. If you believe in the latter, why can't you believe in the former? According to what one has believed in and expected after death, such is the state one will have. He who expected no life to come will have an absolute blank amounting to annihilation in the interval between the 2 rebirths. This is just the carrying out of the program we spoke of, and which is created by the materialist himself. But there are various kinds of materialists, as you say. A selfish wicked egoist, one who never shed a tear for anyone but himself, thus adding entire indifference to the whole world to his unbelief, must drop at the threshold of death his personality forever. This personality having no tendrils of sympathy for the world around, and hence nothing to hook on to the string of the sutratma, every connection between the 2 is broken with the last breath. There being no devotion for such a materialist, the sutratma will reincarnate almost immediately. But those materialists who erred in nothing but their disbelief, will oversleep but one station. Moreover, the time will come when the ex-materialist will perceive himself in the eternity and perhaps repent that he lost even one day, or station, from the life eternal. X. Still, would it not be more correct to say that death is birth into a new life, or a return once more to the threshold of eternity? M. You may if you like. Only remember that births differ, and that there are births of stillborn beings, which are failures. Moreover, with your fixed Western ideas about material life, the words living and being are quite inapplicable to the pure subjective state of post-mortem existence. It is just because of such ideas, save in a few philosophers who are not read by the many and who themselves are too confused to present a distinct picture of it, that all your conceptions of life and death have finally become so narrow. On the one hand, they have led to crass materialism, and on the other, to the still more material conception of the other life which the spiritualists have formulated in their Summerland. There the souls of men eat, drink, and marry, and live in a paradise quite as sensual as that of Muhammad, but even less philosophical. Nor are the average conceptions of the uneducated Christians any better, but are still more material, if possible. What between truncated angels, brass trumpets, golden harps, streets in paradisiacal cities paved with jewels, and hellfires, it seems like a scene at a Christmas pantomime. It is because of these narrow conceptions that you find such difficulty in understanding. And it is also just because the life of the disembodied soul, while possessing all the vividness of reality, as in certain dreams, is devoid of every grossly objective form of terrestrial life, that the Eastern philosophers have compared it with visions during sleep.